Welcome to the Bible Beer Consortium.
Woo. Are they clapping for the Bible or the beer, or both?
Both, absolutely. So in that order. So anyways, we're sponsored tonight by the Fairmont Music Hall, and we definitely appreciate the BBC Faithful Remnant members who gratefully support this consortium. Ezra Boggs, who usually is hosting, is not here tonight due to some employment commitments that he had with the Department of Homeland Security. He's assisting the Office of Response and Recovery with efforts in Hawaii due to issues related to the ongoing volcanic eruption. So think about him when he's trying to take care of some people through that process. We do have some special guests in the audience. We have the DFW Reform Group, Fellowship of Free Thought, DFW Coalition of Reason, and the Metroplex Atheists.
You might be outnumbered today.
A little bit. Huh? You didn't get any, hoots or hollers there, did you?
Where's my wife?
There you go. That's all you need. So, a little bit about tonight's format. It's not an official debate. It's more of a dialogue or discussion, hence why we're sitting around a table with, I'm the only one with a drink, so maybe someone can take care of y'all a little later.
How'd that happen?
I don't know. So, but it's more of a discussion tonight. We'll have both Blake and Matt open up a little bit with some thoughts on the topic, which I'll introduce here in a moment. And then we're going to go into more like 45 minutes, 60 minutes of just discussion back and forth, which I will gracefully interrupt just so I'm just not sitting up here doing nothing. So, but anyways, and then we'll take a 10-minute break, so go to the bathroom, get refills and the like, maybe get y'all some drinks up here too. And then have some Q&A from the audience, I believe is how that will work. And then we'll have y'all close out, and that'll be the evening. So that's the goal. Real quickly, I'm going to introduce our speakers and actually dialogue partners. Blake is the founder of BeliefMap.org, and he's an advanced debate simulator for exploring the question of God's existence and Jesus' resurrection. As an enthusiast, he's been studying these debates and cataloging the academic responses and counter-responses for about 15 years to evangelize and aid in the public in navigating their way to belief in Christ. He's helped teach at churches, university campuses, apologetics conferences. He's also premiered on the UK's premier Christian radio program, 5 times on the Dogma Debate Radio. He's been a guest on several podcasts and engaged in formal debates with atheists on these topics, as well as defend the central true claims of the Christian faith. He's married to his ridiculously hot wife. I'm reading this. So that's the truth, according to Blake. I think, Blake, you wrote this, huh?
It's from the Belief Map page.
There you go. So he's a ministry partner with him, and his hobbies and research include defeating Ganon. Am I saying that correct?
You have not played Zelda?
Oh, no, I'm not. I'm
What's
a
wrong
big
with this?
Zelda fan.
Ganon,
sorry, I apologize.
Ganon.
So I've totally discredited myself today, haven't I? I apologize.
What, this Star Wars shirt?
Have you
Yeah,
found
you're
all
a
the
poser.
correct stones yet?
What's that?
Have you found all the correct stones yet?
No, have you?
Not all.
Most of them. I think I'm like at 300.
I'll have to check later.
Yeah, that's a different discussion in there. So anyways, he definitely ping pong players, Super Smash Brothers, Connect 4.
Oh, yeah.
All right, very
I love
good. Matt Dillahunty over here is an atheist activist, public speaker, and a magician. After 25 years as a fundamentalist Christian, reason forced him to give up his religious beliefs and embrace skepticism, humanism, and atheism. He recently concluded the Canadian and United States legs of his Magic and Skepticism World Tour. He hosts the Atheist Experience TV show, taking live calls from people around the world each Sunday, produces educational videos for his Atheist Debate Patreon project, and regularly travels the world to do lectures and debates on religion, philosophy, magic, skepticism, epistemology, morality, and secular humanism. So with our introductions out of the way, and with our format before us for our dialogue, the topic that we're going to discuss tonight is, can faith be rational? And I'm going to open it up for Blake to sort of open us up here, and he's going to define some terms, have some initial thoughts, and let him speak for a moment. Then we'll give Matt an opportunity, and then we'll open up to form a dialogue and back and forth discussion between y'all.
Very good. All right, so first, hey guys, good to see you all. It's a pleasure to be back here with you. I recognized a lot of faces. Actually, the first time I was here was with Matt Dillahunty. This is where we had our first discussion, so it's good to be back. Come full circle. Right, the topic is, can faith be rational? And I guess first we're going to have to define our terms, or else we're going to be talking past each other. And I'm just going to sort of spitball this. I was thinking it was just going to be a straight conversation, but I guess we're going to give about 10 minutes of opening statements. So I'm just going to do what I can to summarize my position, and I guess my general strategy in speaking with Matt, and hopefully adding a little clarity at the beginning that can help us moving forward. So I see three terms here that probably need some elucidating. We're going to have to ask ourselves what we mean by faith, what we mean by rational, and then what we mean by can. In terms of faith, I think that there's actually a widespread misconception among atheists, at least a lot of the ones on the internet community, about at least what Christians mean by faith, or the religious. So I know there's a poll that was done on radio where a question was asked, and the question was basically, when Christians use the word faith, do they mean belief without evidence? And this was very intelligently posed to atheists and to believers, to Christians. And it turned out that, what was the numbers? 91% of the Christians rejected this. They said, no, that's not what Christians mean when they say faith. But then when you looked at how the atheists answered in terms of what they thought Christians meant, it turned out that 72% thought that is what they meant. And so there's sort of this disparity between what Christians actually mean and what can sometimes be thought of as faith. Typically, I know in the internet community, faith is often understood to be, with the qualifier, blind faith. But that's not what we mean. I asked John Mark Reynolds, who was originally going to be at this debate, what he meant when he put this title together, and he said he just means what Christians normally mean when they use the word faith. In sort of folk terms, it means trust. That's all Christians typically mean when they say that they have faith in God. And I think that this makes sense too biblically. So if you look at the Bible, it's just very clear that it means faith. If you look at like secular dictionaries and encyclopedias on the Bible, like the 6-volume Yale Anchor Bible Commentary, it's going to say straightforwardly, this is what it meant for the early Christians and up to Christianity today is faith. Same thing for the Oxford Companion to the Bible, it's going to say the same thing. And this is easy to show as well because the Greek word faith, pistis, just means trust. So that's another reason to understand that. And finally, against this idea that it's blind faith, consider the apostles and consider Moses and all the heroes in biblical history. They all saw incredible miracles and things that constituted really good evidence for what they believed in. And nevertheless, they are icons of faith. And so for these kinds of reasons, I don't know if it should be too controversial that in this context, a biblical context, that by faith we simply mean trust. So anyways, if you're an atheist and you're thinking it meant something different, I hope that this clarifies a little bit about what Christians mean. So now what about rational, or more specifically, what's a rationally acceptable belief? What do we mean by that? And this is a huge topic. In the field of epistemology, the branch of philosophy that focuses on what constitutes knowledge and what constitutes rational belief, there's a diversity of views, tons of peer-reviewed literature on this, so singling out one particular view isn't always the easiest to do, but there are some that are very popular, and I am very interested in what's called a proper functionalist analysis, but I think I'm most interested in an internalist, a particular kind of internalist understanding. So here's how I would put it out. See what you think of this, and we'll work with it over the course of our discussion. But maybe we can say a belief, B, is rationally acceptable for a subject S at time t if and only if either one, this is two things, but one, B is directly evident to S at t, Or 2, B is evidently well supported by other beliefs that are rationally acceptable for S at T.
Well, let me interrupt there, Blake. This is a discussion, not a calculus class. Maybe you can unpack that a little bit for us. I don't mean interrupting your introduction, but I'm totally lost. I don't know what you're talking about anymore.
All I heard was BS. Sorry, it's an easy joke.
Okay, so this is a recursive analysis, which means that there are 2 things that you're taking into account. First, you want to find out, is something directly evident to me in the sense that am I being appeared to in a way that a tree is in front of me? So how do we know that a tree is there? Well, there's this seeming. I have a perceptual experience, and on the basis of that seeming, I just directly infer that there's a tree there. So that would be an example of a direct inference, something that's directly evident to you. But this can work for memory. It can work for intuition and knowledge of things like 2 + 2 = 4. But once you have some of these beliefs in place, then you have a next step. You can take these new beliefs and then use them to build your structure of knowledge. New beliefs can be built from beliefs that you've acquired that way. So that's all I'm meaning. Finally, in terms of the term can, I think we mean here metaphysical possibility, and that just means that we're asking, is there a possible world or a conceivable circumstance where religious faith or trust is rational, or it is inherently, or alternatively, is it inherently and unavoidably irrational? I tend to think that's kind of what we're going to be talking about. I guess in terms of framing what we're doing, I've got 2 general contentions, I guess, two things that I think we should consider. And one, is it the case that there are better reasons to think that faith can be rational? Or alternatively, are there better reasons to think that faith can't be rational? And I think that's what we should be focusing on. I don't know, for example, whether we should bother too much over whether one or the other can be demonstrated. We just want to have an idea of who has the best case, what's the strongest position, where does the evidence point most. And I guess if the pro side has the strongest arguments or the strongest reasons, that's a reason to move forward, move a little bit towards confidence that faith can, in fact, be rational. I guess that's as much of an opening as I'd want to offer, I guess, for now.
All right. With that, let's turn it over to Matt.
How much time was that?
That's about 7 minutes.
Well done.
He did very well.
Hi. So just for the record, Blake isn't the only person that I can debate. He just happens to be one of my favorites, and we got him to fill in last minute when Reynolds couldn't be here. And I'm very happy about that because we always have some of my favorite discussions. I don't think we have to spend too much time worrying about maybe definitions of can or can't. I followed that was a joke, but I did follow the BS and T stuff, and I'm fine with the notion that a direct demonstration of something, although we get in trouble when we talk about something that seems reasonable when we're trying to define reasonable, you're going to find that over and over again. And if all you mean by faith is confidence, well then of course, any confidence level in any belief may or may not be reasonably justified. And so if the question is, can confidence be reasonable? Yes. But why not just use the word confidence? If I have confidence or trust in something, I don't ever use the word faith. And what I find in the interactions, granted, more sophisticated theologians, people who've studied by and large, you'll get into various definitions or usages of faith. But as somebody who takes live calls every Sunday from people who just sit in the pew, largely the usage of faith that I get from them is, I don't have a good reason. If I had a good reason, I'd give you a good reason. I just take it on faith. Not necessarily a blind faith. This is why when you look at the study and 91% of Christians say that, no, we're not talking about faith without evidence, and the atheists are like, yeah, that seems to be what it is. It's because nobody thinks that they don't have good reasons for their beliefs. So, of course, if you ask Christians, hey, by faith, are you talking about blind faith, faith without evidence? They're going to say no, because they think they have good reasons. And the atheists who are saying yes are saying, I know you think you have good reasons. I'm not convinced that you actually do. And for me, one of the problems is that when you look at faith, you have faith as confidence, as a confidence level. You have, or trust if you prefer. But then you have faith as a methodology. Or when I go through, for example, what the Bible has to say about faith, which isn't necessarily the only reference we should point to, I would agree that I think if you took every verse where faith is mentioned, the majority of those refer to it as confidence, or this is what I have trust in, etc. There are, though, verses that suggest that it view it in more of a sense of epistemology, that faith is the reason. You go back to Hebrews 11, where it says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. There are verses like that. And the thing to watch for, because I would agree, can faith be rational? Yes, if you mean you have confidence in something. If you're using a colloquial faith, I have confidence that this chair will hold me. I would never say that I have faith that this chair will hold me, just because I don't want to add to the confusion. And so when somebody is saying that faith is rational, the things to watch for are equivocation fallacies. The things to watch for are they talking about, I have confidence for good reason based on evidence, which I can present, and then switching context to the reason I believe is because of faith, as if this confidence can extend to be a foundation in and of itself. I do disagree when Blake had said that he doesn't think we need to really bother with demonstrations. I don't know how you could make a case for something being reasonable or rational without a demonstration. To me, that's foundational, because we know that the direct experience may well be rational, and yet you can be wrong. This is something I think we would agree on, that you can reach a conclusion rationally, and it still be the wrong conclusion. As a magician, I exploit this all the time. My job is to lead people towards what would seem to be a rational conclusion based on the evidence that they have, and yet they're wrong. So tonight isn't really about is the Christian faith or faith in Christianity right or wrong. We've done that before and can do it again. But my concern here is that in the broader context, when people talk about faith, they talk about it in different ways. They say, this is my faith, the Christian faith. This is what I have faith in, or this is what my confidence is in. And then they will use it in a third sense, where faith is the justification, going back to Hebrews 11. And so if I had like one of those wheels that you would find at a casino where you put your dollar down and they spin it, and there's all kinds of prizes, and most of them are garbage, and one of them is $1 million. If you were to say, can you win $1 million on this wheel? Well, the answer would be yes, assuming it's not rigged and there's actually $1 million thing on there. But the likelihood that you're going to win $1 million is something that's far more concerning for me. And if people were to spin that wheel and say, I have faith that I'm going to win $1 million, we would laugh. And if we talk about what needs to be demonstrated, is there likely to be a debate that has as its topic, is science reasonable? Is science rational? Is evidence reasonable? Is it reasonable to rely on evidence? We could get into a loop where I present evidence and argument for why we should consider evidence and argument reliable, and we may never get out of that loop, but at least we can get to the point where it's at least self-evidently convincing. I think we both agree that evidence and relying on evidence is reasonable. But if faith as a justification, as a foundation, which I understand Blake's not defending, but if for those that would, which is what got me to take the subject in the first place, if faith were the foundation, then you would find yourself saying, I have faith that faith is reasonable. Not I have evidence that faith is reasonable, not that I have good reasons that faith is reasonable. You would say, I have faith that faith is reasonable. And that is a problem, because while I can't demonstrate that faith could never be reasonable, even in that context, I could point out a whole bunch of examples where people have pointed to faith as a justification, and they were clearly wrong. We're all aware of that. There's 1,000 denominations of Christianity. I could have faith that white people are better than black people. I could take any position and root it by just saying, I don't need to present the actual evidence. I'm just going to say that I have confidence, or I have faith that this is here. Because if I ask you why you believe something, and you have good reasons, you tend to give those good reasons. We don't hear appeals to faith in science. We don't hear appeals to faith in history even. I mean, they'll talk about, confidence level, or somebody reported this, or we consider this to be reliably evidenced in this sense. It's only, as far as I can tell, in the discussions about religions that people make the faith appeal. So I don't think we're going to probably have a lot of problems with equivocation tonight, because he's not defending a notion that faith as an epistemology is necessarily rational. But there's a sub-issue here which came up even with what you were talking about, which is you said Moses saw miracles that constituted good evidence, except that I have no reason to think that any of that happened, that Moses existed and saw something that constituted good evidence, or even that if you witnessed something like that, that it would in fact constitute good evidence. I certainly agree that if you saw something, you might reasonably be led to a conclusion, and we're not going to dick around about whether or not it's a correct or incorrect conclusion. But if all we mean is it's confidence, then sure, I can have confidence in anything. I avoid using the faith label in particular to avoid that equivocation fallacy of saying this is my reason. And when I went through the list of verses, Matthew 21:22, whatever you ask for in prayer, you'll receive if you have faith. That sounds like confidence. Romans 10, faith comes from hearing, hearing through the word of Christ. That sounds like confidence, that the word is going to build the confidence within you. 2 Corinthians, walk by faith, not by sight. And it's probably only the one in Hebrews 11 where faith is presented as the foundation. Faith is the evidence. And yet, I would hope that almost everybody would agree that evidence is evidence. We wouldn't have to give it another label. And that using the label in this way is confusing. I think there would be far fewer atheists who looked at Christian faith as blind faith if, by and large, they ran into believers who were consistent in the usage and not jumping back and forth between, because confidence, you could just be saying, I'm really, really convinced that this is the case. I have a high confidence level that this is true, which is completely independent from whether or not that confidence level is justified and whether or not you reached it through a reasonable process. So you could have really good reasons for believing something and having a high confidence level. I have a hard time calling that faith instead of confidence. And I don't know where that leaves us or gets us, other than, hey, welcome to the Bible and Beer Consortium discussion on faith.
Well, there you go. Well, thank you, Matt, I think, obviously, from the discussion, we have some disagreements. And this is where we can just open it up for dialogue back and forth, for clarity or disagreement. And then exploring those disagreements. So however y'all want to explore this forward, feel free.
Can I start?
Of course.
All right. So a lot of what you said, totally agree with you. And it sounds like we agree on probably the most important point, in fact, of the title of this discussion, Can Faith Be Rational? Because we're saying that we agree that it can be reasonable for some people in the sense that they can hold a certain kind of confidence in it. And given their experiences, if you think of, the Apostle Paul, he at least testifies to having an experience of Jesus having appeared to him, and this, as a result, turned him into one of the greatest evangelists in history. And it was a radical transformation. And so I think we agree in saying Paul, given his experience, could well have been rational. Maybe he experienced something that for him was good evidence. Are we on the same page there?
I think so. If I can, let me kind of tweak this. I think it's entirely possible for someone, based on the limited information they have, to reasonably come to the conclusion that they have lucky socks. Doesn't mean their socks are lucky. And there's a distinction I think we'd make between, is their confidence level truly justified? Is it supported by evidence? Or did they reach it through a reasonable conclusion? When I talk about doing magic to fool people, that's what we exploit. And there was a guy who emailed me just this week to tell me how incredibly smart he was and how stupid I was, because he's convinced that psychics are real, and he's got massive amounts of evidence, he says, for psychics being able to communicate with the dead. This is why I make this distinction between, I think you can be entirely reasonable in your process, but incomplete to the point where you can reach a wrong conclusion.
Yeah, good.
But what bothers me is that, by and large, when we talk just, in public, I mean, if you look at like a definition of reasonableness, one of them will just say sound, that this is a sound, justified thing, which ties it to true. And so colloquially, we'll just say, oh, that's reasonable. And we mean true. We mean that is most likely true, rather than I understand that you might have a good reason to think that. And I think we need to do a better job distinguishing between those two.
Okay. And then a couple more comments. Sure. So just so there's no misunderstanding, when I was citing Moses and these biblical figures, I wasn't anticipating that you would believe that these were real historical figures. The aim was more to say, hey, what do Christians mean, and what did the biblical authors mean by the word faith? And insofar as they're biblical heroes, all had great evidence and were still considered great men of faith, that says something about what early Christians meant by the word. That's all.
If you're convinced that Moses experienced, a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, and that he was an otherwise reasonable person who could have perhaps sawn through trickery or whatever else, then it makes sense to say that Moses would reach a reasonable conclusion that it was God, whether it was or not. The problem is that we start multiplying these uncertainties within here. So now we have issues surrounding Moses. But if we say that Moses was reasonable, that doesn't mean that it's reasonable for you to reach the same conclusion that Moses reached without the direct evidence he had, just because he reached it.
Yeah, this is just, I don't think this is controversial. This is what leads, again, biblical dictionaries and commentaries to say this is what was meant by the biblical authors. That's all I'm saying is, in terms of what Christians mean, or at least academic Christians, I recognize you come across some interesting ones on your radio show. But
I was one, and I've used it both ways. This is I think maybe some churches are doing a disservice by playing fast and loose with language, because when you talk about confidence levels, and there are people whose confidence is like, there's nothing you could ever do that would change my mind. Okay, well then there's no point in us having a discussion.
Dogmatism.
But how many times, have you been in a church? I know it happened to me all the time, where it's, I know that I know that I know that I know. It's this hyperbole of confidence. And if you liken that to why I have confidence that this chair will hold me, which now I'm not quite as confident, but if you put those two in the same category, that's where I think we kind of are misleading people about what we mean.
Okay, I have some thoughts there, but also I wanted to say something about Hebrews 11:1, that one scripture. I actually think there's a misunderstanding there. The King James Version says that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. But in modern commentaries, that's done away with, because that's not what the Greek word there means. It's the conviction of things unseen. That's what it is in the Greek. So now there's a pretty universal understanding of faith in biblical language. As stressed.
And so if I go, first of all the AV 1611 folks are going to be really pissed that you said that, because they're only down with that one particular version, which guided the bulk of Christianity for the last, couple hundred years. But I'm fine with that, and I'm fine with going to Greek stuff. If it turns out that the Bible only ever mentions faith in the sense of confidence, then I would say everything that we're going to discuss is irrelevant. Because, quite frankly, I don't care what somebody's confidence level is. You don't have to have 100% confidence in order to take action on it. All you have to do is be convinced. And I'm far more, granted, I just completely derailed the debate. Sorry, moderator.
Good. No debate involved.
I'm far more concerned with whether or not something is true, whether or not the confidence level is justified, than what the confidence level is. And so as long as somebody's convinced of something, you could be just, like, I could be barely convinced that Moses saw a pillar of cloud. Actually, whatever. See, this is why I don't do this. What actually concerns me is whether or not the miracle is true and occurred, and what it would take for it to be justifiable for me to accept that that's the case, or any modern person, removed from the events, where we don't have the direct experience that you're talking about.
So when you talk about justifiable, do you mean rational?
Well, essentially, I mean, I think there's more to justifiability than the BS&T shortcut that you were doing. When I was doing this, I was going to do the same thing. I was going to give several different definitions of faith and several different definitions of rational, and I was going to mostly skip can because I didn't want to sound like Bill Clinton about what is. But on rational, for me, what I would normally consider rational is something where you have justifiable, plausible conviction that this is true or likely true, that it comports to reality in some sense. That merely being internally consistent is not really that much of value. The people who can become convinced that they have lucky socks, they are working with, as far as I can tell, insufficient information to reach the conclusion that they have. So when we say that somebody is, it's almost like we're saying you're being as reasonable as you're capable of being. And I would like a better standard than that, where in much the same way that when the Supreme Court tries to figure out what a reasonable person would do, they don't go to the least common denominator of what the minimally reasonable person would do. They would talk more about an average or what we would expect from someone out in the world experiencing things. I would like us to get closer to that, or maybe set the bar a little higher when we're talking about reasonableness, so that we're more likely to get closer to truth.
Yeah. So let's figure out where we want to go then.
Okay.
So we agree that given someone's data, they could rationally believe in all sorts of things.
Yep.
We've been in positions, both of us, where we come to false beliefs that even in retrospect look ridiculous.
Anybody who thinks they don't have a false belief is wrong.
Right, has a false belief.
That's their false belief.
Absolutely. So maybe what's worth talking about is you alluded to justification. Maybe when can we reach a justified belief in something like God is trustworthy? What are the circumstances? Maybe ideal circumstances, good circumstances, sufficient circumstances. How would you approach that? Maybe we can start that way.
Yeah, so now I think we're probably getting into why I rely so much on skepticism, and in part, and we don't have to completely rehash this because there was quite a bit of focus of this when you came down to the house and we posted that video talking about what standards of evidence should we have. For me, if you want to just say faith is confidence, okay, now I have to ask a second question, which is, what is your level of confidence and why? And it's the why that really matters. And you would almost need to kind of give a concrete example. My problem is the category that we're talking about when we talk primarily about religious belief. When somebody says, I believe that Jesus is Lord, that he came down here as God's incarnation, died for our sins, was resurrected on the third day and rose up to heaven, and is the price paid for all of our sins, that's a cool statement of faith. And then I would say why. I don't care that you have confidence in it as much as why.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah.
So
all day.
Just to be as precise as possible, what if we worked out maybe an analysis for you of what a justifiable belief would look like? Like, what are the conditions under which a belief would be justifiable? So maybe we could work something out together and see what that could look like. So
without getting all concrete, the one I typically go with is the same methods that we would use within science, where a claim is testable if and only if it's also falsifiable. Unfalsifiable claims, I don't know how you can have a justification for accepting a claim that's unfalsifiable.
Real quick, so maybe what if we started this way? A belief is rationally justifiable. I think that's what we want to focus on. If and only if, and then how would you fill in the blank from there?
Belief is rationally justifiable if and only if. It's probably going to be hard to do on the fly, but
yeah, and we can work together.
So, yeah, the de facto thing. The de facto thing is if there's sufficient evidence. But now you have to say, okay, what counts as sufficient evidence? Mm-hmm. And one of the most common questions I get is, what would change your mind about God? And I have to answer, I have no idea, because I don't know how to tell the difference between an incredibly advanced technology and a God. Mm-hmm. Because I would have to know more to be able to understand the difference between them. Mm-hmm. So For me, and you can find a way to phrase this better than I can, rather than trying to narrow down exactly what would be sufficient evidence, because that's going to change based on the nature of the claim. You tell me you got a new dog the other day, I'm just going to accept that as face value because it's mundane. Mm-hmm. It is, I know people have dogs, I know they get dogs all the time. Yes, I was just with an awesome dog right before we got here, Opie. But see, the dog distracted me. So this issue of sufficient evidence, for me, we talk about Paul and the road to Damascus experience. Mm-hmm. Anything of that nature, I don't know how you could justifiably come to a conclusion about the source, because how do you rule out that this wasn't some delusion to you? So one factor is definitely independent verification as much as possible. It is contingent upon how extraordinary the claim is, how much evidence and what type of evidence.
Let me see what you think of this. This is me looking at some of the stuff you've said and tried to pull it together into an analysis and see if this sounds similar to what your view is, and then we can modify it as we need to.
Blake is going to Reader's Digest my brain. So when the book's done, I'll give it to you first.
So what do you think about this? A belief that X exists or X explains Y is rationally justifiable only if, and here we have two things, X is demonstrated to be possible and the belief is a deliverance of a reliable method.
Sure.
So I'm thinking that's the heart of it. And then we ask ourselves, what does it take for X to be demonstrated to be possible? And here's where I'm going to need some help. It might be, I've heard things that sound like, well, it's demonstrated to be possible if we have past confirmations of it, or alternatively, maybe of things like it. How would you flesh that out?
I'm fine with categorical similarities. You know, it's so like the wheel example I used. It's pretty easy to figure out what's possible on the wheel because it's all marked. But if we covered up everything on the wheel and they spun it and then they revealed what it was so that you couldn't calculate what was possible beforehand, you might still be justified by knowing, hey, there's 50 other casinos in town, they have similar wheels, nobody's going to let me put down $1 and give me a 50% chance of winning $1 million. And so there's inferences about how these sorts of things work where you could come up with a reasonable conclusion about what's likely to be possible on that particular wheel. So you wouldn't necessarily have to have a specific calculable information. Inferences are fine, and categorical inferences are fine as well.
So in terms of demonstration, say that again for me. How would you understand demonstrated to be possible? When do we get that?
That is when the evidence from a reliable source. Now we're caught because you can't go with like, I don't know, maybe for the purposes of this you can say that it's self-evident, obvious, because I don't think we need to get down to is reason reasonable or, you know, are my senses reliable? The way I tell whether or not my senses are reliable is by getting independent confirmation from other people. I mean, I can say, hey, is that a glass of water? And, you know, we can investigate it in a number of ways. We're going to directly collect evidence. We are going to compare it to what we know. We're going to seek independent confirmation and, when possible, replication.
Okay, so we're demonstrating that X is possible if it's self-evident. Are there any other examples where something might be demonstrated to be possible?
I have no idea.
Okay, so like...
Are there?
So what about like...
Where we disagreed before was whether or not something is possible until shown to be impossible, and whether or not it's impossible until shown to be possible. Yeah, and my position is it's neither until that's demonstrated.
So, like, what would you do with historical facts? Can we demonstrate in this way? Is it rationally justifiable to believe in a historical fact, and can we demonstrate that some historical facts have occurred? Do they meet the definition of demonstrated?
You'd have to, because everything is a historical fact. Even if I talk about what happened 10 seconds ago or 5 seconds ago, I mean, it's history. Granted, there's a recording. If we go back further in history, the only thing we can do is rely on inferences and the reports that we have.
Mm-hmm. But like, think of like Alexander the Great says, you know, we have a report. Alexander the Great gave this speech. These are some of the words of the speech. The report the source seems reliable. Is that an instance, have we demonstrated that Alexander gave this speech or said something along these lines?
So I would suggest that it's probably best not to even talk about it in that, oh, we've done this. Well, it would be better to just say, we have reports that Alexander said this. And it depends in part on what was said. It depends on part on who's reporting it. One of the things when it comes to like independent confirmation of historical figures or potential historical figures are the reports we have all coming from one side of a story versus two sides. And if you have like the pro-Teddy Roosevelt and anti-Teddy Roosevelt people writing something and they're in agreement, then I think that we have a much stronger reason to believe that that is an accurate representation than if it's a biased source.
Yeah, so I really want to understand what you mean by X is demonstrated to be possible, because I know in our conversations you've mentioned it a lot, and I want to pin down an understanding of what it is for something to be demonstrated, because maybe by demonstrated you could say something like, hey, there is a high likelihood of it being true given the data that you have, given the evidence you've come across.
So now you're going to likelihood of being true, which is separate from possible. So if I have a six-sided die, a standard one that we'd find there, is it possible for it to roll a 2? Yes, because that's part of the demonstrated, or part of the definition of that, and we can demonstrate it by doing it. It gets a little more complicated as we get out of there. Is it possible that there's a diamond, buried in my backyard? I don't see any reason why we should conclude it's impossible. We know that people have buried diamonds. We know that diamonds exist. Every aspect of that is independently possible, and so the collection seems like it's possible. This has nothing to do with how likely it is that there's a diamond. It's just, is it possible? Epistemically possible, sure. Materially possible, yes. Is it possible that there's an alien from Alpha Centauri buried in my backyard? I have no way to conclude that that's possible because I don't know anything about aliens from Alpha Centauri and whether or not they even exist or existed, whether or not they could have traveled, this distance. There are too many independent variables that are not verified. Mm-hmm. And so if you're going to try to demonstrate that something's possible, I would say that you would need to show that the primary variables are independently possible. Similarly, if you were going to try to show that something is impossible, you would need to show that the primary variables are not possible.
And sorry, what did you mean by primary variables?
Well, within the terms, diamond, yard, buried, all of these things we know people can do this sort of thing. We don't know whether or not there are aliens from Alpha Centauri.
Okay, very good. And so, and for people who are like, why are they even talking about this? Because this relates to the grand question about whether some religious beliefs can be rationally justified. Because if a criterion of a rational or justified, let's focus on justified, a justified belief in something supernatural requires first the demonstration of possibility, and if demonstrating possibility means doing this thing over here that theists haven't done, then the end conclusion is that theists can't, or a person can't justifiably reach belief in the supernatural, Yeah. And that's kind of where things are with you, right? That's why you want to.
I'm full on record, both in our discussion and in multiple videos. I know of no way to demonstrate that the supernatural is real or is even possible. In much the same way that we would say, is it when you'll occasionally use Bayesian analysis for. Matter of fact, you're going to be debating a friend of mine in like 2 days, I think, right?
I didn't know y'all were friends, but it sounds like it.
I did a show. We disagreed about morality, but he's awesome.
Cool. Okay.
And free will. We disagreed on 2 things, but we got it sorted. If we say God is the best explanation, I have an objection in the sense that we haven't demonstrated that God is even a possible explanation. Mm-hmm. And so when we talk about is it possible that a God exists, I put that roughly in the same category as aliens from Alpha Centauri, only I would have to argue that aliens from Alpha Centauri are necessarily more plausible than a God because at least they're natural, at least they're potentially within there's no appeal to some violation of the laws of physics to get to an alien, whereas that might be the case for a God. But it depends on the definitions.
can I put my cards on the table, kind of my thinking on this?
Yeah.
So the way it comes across to me is that, hey, I've got a nice, academically rigorous, standard way of arriving at beliefs, and according to these standards, abductive, inductive, deductive reasoning, and like you said, in the inductive category, I'm a Bayesian. These are really well-developed methods for arriving at truth. And if you use these methods as they're used in academia, then there's no problem arriving at the conclusion of a God as long as you play by the rules. And the thing is there's no rule that corresponds to what you've in the past identified as being a rule, namely that it is demonstrated first. And so, just so we're on the same page, so that you can help me, I'm standing here and I'm like, if what Matt's saying is true, if this is a really good method, I want it. I want that thing. But it's nowhere to be found out here, and I don't know why I should accept it. So here's would
What do
be
you mean it's nowhere to be found out there? It's science.
No, I don't think it's science.
Science is methodological naturalism. It can make no statements about the supernatural.
This principle. So this principle isn't in science. That before you can infer that X exists, you have to demonstrate that X is possible.
No, that's not what I'm saying. Let's go to the Higgs.
Mm-hmm.
That was an inference to the existence of something.
Mm-hmm.
But there was no the constituent variables of that were known physically. There's no violation of anything that we know. There's no reason to think it's impossible. We then begin an exploration for it. We may find it, we may not. If we don't find it, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But if we do find it, it does. Mm-hmm. And so this is a testable hypothesis that is essentially falsifiable in the sense that if we found something else, that would show that the Higgs isn't the explanation that we thought it was. And we had this label. We didn't have to first go out and say, we need to demonstrate this is possible. But until such time as there was a demonstration, it is not rationally justified to accept it as the explanation or even a likely explanation, because there's no demonstration of likelihood there.
So here's how it comes across to me. So I'm presenting to Matt the case for God, and I'm giving what seems to me to be like really good evidences over the course of we had 3 formal debates so far.
Yep.
And I'm throwing out all this data that I think fits on theism, is more probable and expected on theism than on its negation, on atheism as understood canonically. And whenever I present these sorts of evidences, you come back and you say, well, and there's this catch-all philosophical objection. Regardless, you can't conclude that God is the explanation of that until we demonstrate that God is possible.
Correct.
And in the case of the Higgs field, and tell me where the disconnect is. So what would be analogous in the Higgs field situation is someone's giving you a bunch of evidence for the Higgs field, and then you're saying, well, before we can demonstrate that there's a Higgs field, you have to demonstrate that there is, I don't know how, you'd have to demonstrate that there's a Higgs field first before you can give evidence for it, or before you can...
No.
Yeah, help me out. Where am I
I'm
missing
saying
that?
that you would have to demonstrate that there's a Higgs field before it's justified for you to accept that the Higgs field exists. Not that it's a potential candidate explanation, but before you... So the time to believe something is after there is evidence for it, after there is reasonable reason to believe that it is the best explanation.
Yeah, of course.
So you can give mountains of evidence that you think is consistent on theism, but that's an intellectual panacea. If it's, hey, we need something that is sufficient to explain the origin of the universe, God is sufficient to explain the origin. Of course it is. Of course it is. It's been a proposed explanation forever. But the time to believe that God is the best candidate, or that it is the candidate, is after there's direct evidence for that.
So what's the direct evidence for, you might have to know some history of science, or do you know the direct evidence for the Higgs field?
From the observations from CERN's particle cloud.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so what those observations, presumably, you say it's a demonstration of the Higgs field or the Higgs particle.
I'm not convinced
quick.
exactly what it demonstrates.
Okay.
I'm talking about what is being reported as the standard scientific explanation.
But the way you're doing it is you're saying, here's some data from CERN, and this data is more likely on the hypothesis that there's this Higgs field than on the hypothesis that there is not one. And I'm doing the exact same thing when I make the case for God and say, here's my data. This is more likely on the hypothesis that God exists than on the hypothesis that God doesn't exist.
Except that there's nothing. So there's nothing about the Higgs field that necessarily violated any understanding of the way the universe works. That's not true for the supernatural. The supernatural, by definition, violates everything we understand about nature. Which is why, and it's like, we've repeatedly tested claims of people who think they can do things that they label supernatural, psychics, dowsers, whatever else. Let's say dowsing, when we tested it, actually produced reliable results. All we would then be able to say is that, hey, these guys can do something that we don't have an explanation for. We could then begin, hypothesizing about what natural explanations there were, but we can't begin to hypothesize about supernatural explanations because we have nothing to point to where we can say, here's what the supernatural is. Here's how we've confirmed what the supernatural is. This is why it's a candidate explanation. That is the exact opposite of what we have for natural explanations and potential fields and anything else.
So whether the Higgs field does or doesn't violate our understanding is going to have to do, in my opinion, because I'm a Bayesian, with our background knowledge. And so when you tell me that theism violates our understanding, I'm going to say, wait a second, it doesn't violate our understanding.
It absolutely does. What evidence do we have that there's anything other than the natural world?
But that doesn't mean it violates my understanding.
Okay. You might as well. How do you know that Narnia is not real?
I don't have any evidence for it. I don't know that it's not real, but
I don't know that it's not real either. I don't know that Narnia is not real. I don't know, I suspect it's not. The evidence for that would be, hey, this seems to be a fictional invention of somebody. But skipping back and jumping to science, this is going to piss off some of my physicist friends, sorry. String theory is magic as far as I'm concerned. I don't think it's been demonstrated. I'm not convinced that it's falsifiable. It, to me, is an intellectual exercise amongst mathematicians, physicists, looking for the best explanations. But even in that context, there's nothing about it that, while it may rewrite our understanding of the natural world, there's nothing about it that necessarily violates it. And when people propose a God, what they're proposing is something that is timeless, spaceless, that exists completely absent of all the things that we directly observe. And that's why it doesn't count as a candidate explanation until such time as it's been demonstrated. When you go to, when you've got a particle collider, you're doing an actual physics test there, and what we call it or what we label it, or whether it's even a field, whether there's strings, however we choose to conceptualize these things, are independent from, here's an observation, here's what we think the best explanation is for it. I have a friend who's working on a reworking of Big Bang cosmology, saying essentially the Big Bang cosmology is wrong and there's a new math model that fits it better. But even when that happens, it's not going to change the data that we already have, and it's not going to propose something for which we don't have reason to believe.
So here's, just so you can step into my worldview again, you're saying that the relevant difference is that the Higgs field doesn't violate our understanding. This again, and I feel like I'm having to consult you almost as a prophet on your method, because I can't predict what you're going to say. I don't understand how theism violates my understanding. It doesn't. What is the violation?
What is the violation? Theism proposes something other than the natural world. How do we test for, identify, or confirm something other than the natural world? This is why science relies on methodological naturalism. It doesn't say the supernatural doesn't exist. It says we don't get to make appeals to that because we have no demonstration that it exists. We have no way to...
Real quick, Matt. You're saying that, yes, theism does propose something other than the natural world, and then you ask, how do we test for it? But my question was, how does theism violate our understanding? There's not a violation there just because...
You're getting hung up on this thing about violating understanding. That was the particular words that I used, and maybe it's not clear. independent of what you understand, there is the direct observation in the natural world. If you want to propose a bunch of candidate explanations for an observed phenomena, then your candidate explanations need to either be something that we know about, something that can, we explain things in terms of other things that we already understand or identify.
I don't think that's accurate, because there's lots of stuff in science that's really radically new that can't be explained by making reference to those other things. Maybe you'll just have to elaborate on what you mean by that. So, for example, if you're...
Is there something in science that's so radically new that it's... When we talk about what is an explanation for something, and I'm talking particularly about causality, you make a list of candidate causes. If this table is on fire, and we say, what's the explanations for this? You've got matches and blowtorches and all these things that we know about. Those are all going to be more probable than spontaneous table combustion, for which we have no observation and no understanding. But if we had no other explanation, we would then be at a point where the answer is, we don't know. If someone comes along and says, well, there's nothing about this that violates my understanding of God can make a table burst. Hang on.
Sorry.
That God can make a table burst into flames. And you can say that all day long, and you can say we've been unable to come up with any other explanation for how this table bursts into flames, but my God can do that, and so that becomes a plausible explanation. You do that all day. It doesn't mean that there's any good reason to think that that is even a possible explanation.
Okay, so a few different steps. I actually think the Higgs field is a great analogy. I would love, in both cases, I think the right approach is, as you know, a standard Bayesian approach. I don't think we need any of these rules. I think we just do basic academic Bayesian analysis, and you end up asking yourself, what's the likelihood of this data on the hypothesis that there is a Higgs field? What's the likelihood that on the hypothesis that there's not a Higgs field? And you do the same thing for theism. There's no rules that would prevent theism from being a candidate if you use standard abductive reasoning and standard Bayesian inference. That's where I'm coming from, and I don't know why I should add on extra
What is
criteria.
the likelihood of this hypothesis on magic?
That's vague, so I don't know what that means.
On magic.
What is it? But that's not a proposition. It needs to
What
be
is the likelihood of the table catching fire on a fireball casting wizard doing it? Isn't it pretty much 100%?
Well, on the likelihood that, it's 100%. Yeah.
Okay.
And so
if the model, if this proposed,
you have to take in. Remember, you know this before I even say it. You know that whenever you do a Bayesian analysis, you have to take into account the priors, and then you have to take into account the likelihood of the hypothesis given the evidence, and then the likelihood of the hypothesis. Or excuse me. Yeah, the likelihood of the hypothesis being. I'm getting it backwards. Sorry, continue what you're saying.
Okay, so table bursts into flames.
Mm-hmm.
On the hypothesis that this person is psychically able to cause the table to burst into flames, and then we have, we know that on that model, this is entirely plausible. And of course that's going to fit as an explanation. How likely is it that that person can actually cause things to start fires with their mind? That's the thing that we care about. This is my problem with going through this Bayesian analysis, is that when you have an intellectual panacea, something that can do all, or when you have something that is sufficient, and you have no other explanations, of course that's going to appear to be the best explanation, but we seem to be ignoring the fact that the best answer is, I don't know how that table caught fire, and I can't reasonably reach a conclusion about what the cause was or likely was until I do an investigation. And until I can show that this person can start fires with their mind, it's not even a candidate explanation for the functional reality that this table caught fire.
And just to clarify, do you think that is this like a critique of Bayesian analysis itself, or
no,
it's
a critique on usages of Bayesian analysis. Bayesian analysis is great for medical research and figuring out probabilities of what from a number of candidate options of how likely this is. It's good for a number of other things. I don't think it should go anywhere near the territory of the supernatural or cosmic origins, because first of all, we have one universe, so we got no priors. We have no way to confirm how likely. It may be that on theism, a universe like this is 100%, but that doesn't tell you whether or not it's the right answer. Because on I'm cheating at cards, the likelihood that you're going to get 13 spades is 100%. And yet, we know it is the case that we could legitimately shuffle them and you could still get that. So there's a difference between what the probable explanation is, and maybe I'm not that good at cheating. I am really good at cheating at cards. But when we're talking about what it's reasonable to believe as the best explanation for this, I don't know how we can ever get to the sort of panaceas that we're trying to inject in there.
So you're capitalizing when you talk about the wizard example on the fact that if you invoke in a hypothesis that's sufficiently ad hoc, that has a sufficiently low prior probability, then of course you can produce the data, but you've transferred all of the improbability over onto the hypothesis itself.
Exactly.
And this is something you have to take into account. And I think that when so many theists who are publishing on this answer that question, look into that, they do look into the prior probability of these issues and the prior probability of God's existence, because that's an important component.
And okay. So I'm not aware of anybody who's made a case for the prior probability of anything supernatural.
Callum Miller just published a paper exactly on the prior probability of God.
I'm aware that there are people who claim about this. I'm interested in how is it that you investigate the supernatural beyond an intellectual exercise, beyond hey, here's all these things that we don't have an explanation for, which would seem like they could have potential supernatural explanations. Where is the investigation that shows, of the 5 million times this has happened, 5% of them were supernatural?
You're assuming here, I think, that you have to approach probability as a frequentist, and that doesn't comport with a Bayesian analysis. Bayesians don't have to be frequentists on this. So when scientists
do they have to rely on actual evidence?
Real quick, when scientists use Bayesian inference, you can start with different priors. Consider that Stephen Hawking and Lawrence Krauss and Sean Carroll are all incredibly smart physicists, and yet they disagree. Yeah, and I actually mentioned them precisely because they're atheists. That's why I mentioned those ones. Yeah. So we agree that they're incredibly smart physicists, but they have radical disagreements on things, even if they have the same information. How do we account for that? What makes sense of that? Well, what makes sense of that is the fact that they have different priors. And what Bayesian analysis does, of course, is forces them to expose those priors and be clear about what they are. But as you continue the Bayesian process and as you continue to pull in new data, they're going to be converging on common answers. That's the whole Bayesian project. So, I mean, when you poke fun at these instances where what's the likelihood of a wizard doing it, I mean, I have a very, very low subjective probability assigned to that.
Me too.
Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe, in fact, such a wizard did do it, and these wizards even exist. It doesn't matter. You can start with whatever subjective prior you want. Typically, you structure them in part by looking at what's called the principle of indifference. You have objective ways to inform it in part. But you can have a subjective prior. All that matters is you continue feeding evidence, and you're going to be updating your probability, and it's going to be converging onto the truth. Now, I mention this because you can do the exact same thing when considering theism. Do whatever you want with the prior probability of theism. Now look at the evidence, and if enough evidence accumulates, you get to the conclusion that theism is probably true. And that's all we need. We don't need any of these other criteria to do our rational investigation on the issue.
So when Hawking, Tyson, and Carroll get together, and they have a disagreement about something, and they start going to the evidence so that they can converge on something, the thing that they're going to as evidence doesn't seem to be remotely in the same category of what theists are advocating on behalf of evidence. If that were the case, then those three, among others, would have converged towards theism in the same way that those arguing on behalf of it would. And we would have, the Templeton Foundation wouldn't be the only one giving prizes. You'd have a Nobel Prize for this sort of thing. If, in fact, give an example of a piece of evidence that begins to converge towards theism.
The fact that the universe is life-permitting, given our knowledge of how improbable a life-permitting universe, a life-permitting set of physics is.
Okay. But the thing that you're talking about there is we know that life seems improbable, which actually isn't necessarily the case. We know that the building blocks of life are abundant, and the criteria for life are just present in the universe. And so
Wait, sorry, what?
the universe,
No, I'm not talking about the design of life. I'm talking about the laws of physics themselves being fine-tuned.
sure, but you don't have any evidence that they could have been any other way.
You do.
Live in the universe that produced this.
You do. The way you do that is you can look. Physicists do this. This is not contentious among physicists that the universe is fine-tuned. I know you'll mention Victor Stenger, but he's on. He's on
Victor
the fringe
Stenger,
here.
Lawrence Krauss, Neil Tyson. I can call a couple of them.
No, I don't. Are you sure Neil deGrasse Tyson says that there's no fine-tuning?
Correct.
Okay,
Well, here's the thing. There are people who will acknowledge an appearance of fine-tuning, not. Everybody's going to acknowledge the anthropic principle. There's no denial that we fit the universe that we're in, that the universe had to have these specific physical laws for life to arise here. That's the anthropic principle. That's not even, there's no contention on that.
Move past it, 'cause, right,
Yeah, I'm going to actually interject here because we are actually now moving into actual arguments for and against theism, especially with fine-tuning. I'm actually going to try to
Imagine how that happened.
Exactly. I mean, I thought it would probably, evolve into that. But I'm going to just try to rail us back in. I'm going to go back to some of your opening statements. Matt actually said, and I'm pointing this towards Blake, it said, it's only when we talk about religion do we discuss about faith being rational. We never talk about science being rational. What would you have to say to that?
I would say, but we do talk about scientific theories being rational. So we can talk about whether evolutionary theory is rational, whether string theory is rational, whether various multiverse models are rational. And in that regard, it is like the theistic hypothesis.
Mm-hmm. Now, are you confusing a theory and a discipline, though? When you say talk about a certain scientific theory might be rational or irrational versus the very discipline itself being rational.
Yeah, but I guess in that case, since we're talking about trust in God, that resembles a theory or a proposition. So this is a belief in something. So rather than resembling a discipline, we're talking about a belief itself. So just as we have this belief or trust that God is trustworthy, so too we can have a belief in some theory in science, and we can ask ourselves whether it's rational to believe in that.
For the record, we're in complete agreement there.
Yep.
In the sense that the foundation of science, the methodology that undergirds science, we're not going to talk about whether that's rational in the same sense that if we were talking about whether or not faith as an epistemology were rational, those things are going to be different because I don't see that. But on a particular model, and I said that wrong, but I'll get back to it. On a particular model, you can say, does it use the most reliable methods and reach this conclusion? And of course, you can have debates about that. You can have debates about the model just like you can have a debate about whether or not the Christian model or a Christian model or a Hindu model or whatever else might be an explanation. And this is why I was fine with the notion that if all you mean by faith is confidence, then it can be rational. But if you mean it as a methodology, as a foundation to lead to truth, as an epistemology, that's where we have an issue. And science as a path to truth, we're not going to have that, is science a good way to figure out the universe? Duh. I mean,
I agree.
no, but we're in agreement there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I do agree.
Very good. And now I want to come back to something you said earlier as well, is you said faith is confidence. And I don't know, maybe you might have just agreed that's just as good as a place where it is trust. But isn't that talking about the psychology of someone and not the actual thing itself? I don't know. I'm just trying to explore what you mean by that. By faith, if it's just confidence, then we're really not talking about something being rational. We're just talking about someone's psychology.
Well, you can determine. I agree with you. There's a psychological component to it. I might have a confidence level. Let's say I'm 80% convinced this chair will hold me. That confidence level might have been reached through a reasonable process. And colloquially, we'd say, yeah, Matt's got good reason to think that this chair, but it's not just about. This is why I was saying earlier, I want us to get, not us, but us as a society, to get beyond this person is as justified as they can, they are as reasonable as they can be, and talk about a standard of reasonableness that goes beyond a least common denominator or anything like that. And so when we say, I have confidence, I agree we're talking about a different thing. I have a belief, I have a confidence level in that belief, and then I have whatever reason I have for having the confidence level in that belief. That's independent from I have a belief, I have a confidence level, and my confidence level is appropriately proportioned to the actual confidence level. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I wanted to follow up on that.
But he said no, though.
No, you did? Well, let's
Wait,
explore it. Yes, absolutely.
What did you, in the last sentence, you want proportion?
I have a belief, I have a confidence level. It's a separate issue as to whether or not my confidence level is reasonable based on the information I have, or whether it's reasonable in comparison to the actual justifiable confidence level. So like if I spin the wheel,
Okay,
and I think
you don't need to elaborate. I think,
okay.
If I'm understanding you, I think I...
If I think I have a 50% chance of winning when I actually have a 2% chance of winning, then I could have reached that through reasonable means, but I am so far removed from what confidence level I should have
Got it. Okay,
that
good.
that's a separate issue.
Okay, excellent. Sorry.
All
Sorry
right.
to interrupt.
Now, given that, from the discussion that you and Blake have been having here, it didn't seem that you had a problem with faith being rational. But if having belief in theism is never a possible explanation, how could it ever be rational then, if that's not an option?
So one more time?
Using the supernatural to explain a body of evidence, like Blake is trying to do with his Bayesian theory, and you're saying, no, we can't do that because we don't have any priors or demonstratability of its possibility.
This is about the two types of reasonableness I was
Yes.
talking about. I can completely understand how otherwise reasonable people with insufficient information could reach the conclusion that something supernatural has occurred. I do it all the time. I did it last night in the magic show. Hand somebody a book, pick out whatever word you want. I'm not going to look. I'm going to be over here and everything else, and I'll tell you what word you thought of. For people who don't have enough information, it is perfectly reasonable for them to come to the conclusion that I can actually read their mind. I can't, but it's reasonable for them to conclude that. But when we talk about the best explanation is that Matt can read your mind, the independent confidence level in my ability to read minds, what it should be is independent of what that person thinks it is. So they could be like, oh my gosh, I can't come up with any other explanation. It must be the case that Matt reads minds. And in fact, if they had just a little bit more information, they would come to the quick conclusion, holy crap, Matt's just faking it. And I can understand how and why people reach those conclusions. I'm not saying they're being unreasonable. In the case of magician and mentalist, I am intentionally causing them to be deceived. Outside of that, in the world, we do this to ourselves all the time. We lie to ourselves, we have faulty memory, we reach conclusions quicker than we should, we do it on insufficient evidence, and we also, in the psychological aspect, if you've reached a conclusion, and let's say I'm not completely convinced, I don't want to be rude and say you're an idiot, you're foolish, and I also don't want to say you're wrong, because you might be right. I don't know whether or not you're right. And so we build up these insular environments, is where the psychology comes in, to where, of course, if I'm standing in church and I get goosebumps like everybody else, and everybody else around me is saying, oh, that's the Holy Spirit, then it was reasonable for me, based on the information I had, to conclude that that is the best explanation. But it's not actually, as far as I can tell, the correct one. And with more information and more exploration, we may find that my confidence level was incredibly inappropriate.
We got about 10 minutes before we're going to take a break. So any other things y'all wanted to sort of hash out before we go into that, before we move into the Q&A?
Yeah.
This would be a good opportunity.
I think when you say that their credence level, or what was inappropriate you just said just now?
Confidence level?
Their confidence level, okay, was inappropriate. In what sense was it inappropriate? Are you just saying that they were
in the objective
misinformed?
sense? So as me with my limited knowledge and understanding, I can only assess the information with this, which is why we rely on independent verification and replication and things like that when we can. It may be there is some confidence level that is warranted for any reasonable person with perfect understanding. There's a different confidence level that may be warranted for any reasonable person with limited understanding.
Real quick, if they had perfect understanding, then the confidence level, I guess, would be 1 in all true propositions, right?
I don't accept that a confidence level of 1 is necessarily possible, but this is why I want to talk about maximal confidence, because I can't.
But if they're maximally reasonable, then they can just see the truth. It would be like
Internally, it's 100%.
All
it's
truths,
the external.
Yeah, all truths would be like 1 + 1 = 2, right?
Yeah, but this gets back to something we'll have to discuss another time, which is whether or not you can have absolute certainty about anything, which is why I talk about maximal certainty. However certain you could possibly be, whether it's 1 or 99.999 repeating, there are things that you can be maximally certain about, like math and deductive reasoning, things like that, or anything that comes from that. Mm-hmm. It got real quiet.
It sure did, yeah. Well, let's do this. We're right there on the verge of about 50 minutes of discussion. So let's move into our break. We're going to take about 10, 12-minute break. So the Q&A, we do have a mic right up here, up front. The only thing I ask is you sort of direct your question towards either to Matt or Blake, though I will give both of them opportunities to talk about it or even discuss it. Very, very open. That's how we want to sort of keep the evening going in a more discussion, dialogue format. I do try to keep the question short. I'll even let y'all dialogue a little bit. But if I see a line forming or something like that, I might say, well, let's move on to the next person, though we only have one. I did notice when we started our break, Matt said, well, the hard part's over. Now I can get my margarita. So, well, with that, go ahead and open up with the question.
As you know, the way we discover if there's historical evidence in ancient literature is we use the criteria of embarrassment, like we're pretty sure Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River. John Dominic Crossan said if there's anything historical, it's that he was baptized in the Jordan River and was crucified. We use multiple attestation if we have a lot of independent sources. And Matt here has seemed to go to the historical side, which is good. But here's the problem, is let's say you were reading a book by R.L. Hubbard that was a biography written by a Scientologist. How much faith would you have in that book? Not a lot, because it would be so highly biased. And this is what Christians don't get. When you read the New Testament, you are reading a book that is highly biased. They had a theological axe to grind, and you're not reading an objective account. They didn't have someone from the First Jerusalem Post there to record the events. So my question to you is, how can we have faith in such a high, and by their own admission, they say, we are writing this so you might believe. How can we have faith in a document that's so heavily biased?
Okay, thank you so much. So I think that sometimes people who are heavily interested in the topic because of their bias, so think of like a Holocaust survivor, precisely because of their interest in it, actually put in extra effort to make sure they get things right. There's also a background point that it's actually almost impossible to get rid of all of your biases anyways. Everybody writing has biases, even in textbooks, and you have to control for bias and do your best. Incidentally, some of those criterion you're talking about, the best criterion, the criterion of dissimilarity and the criterion of embarrassment that you mentioned, capitalize on bias. So the point is precisely because they'd be biased not to say this, because it embarrasses them, the fact that they're saying it goes to show that we should assign a little bit more likelihood that they're telling the truth here. Now, of course, you apply other tests to make sure that what they're saying isn't just something they genuinely believe, but it's actually true if you want to get down to the history of it. But overall, I don't think that I'm too worried about the fact that it's written by biased persons, because historians deal with that all the time, and they can work through it really well.
But the great demythologizers like Strauss and Boltzmann in the 19th century, the great German scholars, what they did is say, yeah, there's historical truth in the New Testament, but Jesus walking on water, the miracles and all, we just throw them out. You're familiar with that, right? Mm-hmm. So why can't you just do that and accept the bare bones historical?
Oh, I mean, you absolutely could if that were, I mean, you can do whatever you want. I just don't think that's the rational thing to do, especially if I have really good reason to think that God exists, and so therefore that miracles are possible, and I have some really good reason to think that God's interacting with Jesus or even raising Jesus from the dead is the kind of thing that God might do. Then when I come across some historical evidence that testifies to these sorts of things, I can probably take him a bit more seriously than someone who lacks those background beliefs. And this is why, by the way, Bayesian approaches are so important. You have to take into account your priors. You have to analyze those priors. You can't just leave them unanalyzed. But when the whole thing is done, I think that you can very rationally believe in miracles through looking at historical evidence. And Boltzmann and these guys were very mistaken, as even contemporary non-Christian scholars will say. There's far more in it than they could have ever anticipated that is historically reliable.
Can I hear Matt's?
Yeah. So I don't think I'm going to shock Blake too much to let him know that I'm actually largely in agreement. So I'm not a mythicist. I'm kind of ambivalent. Okay. And I find the question of the historicity of Jesus rather a curious one, because it doesn't matter for almost anybody in history, but it absolutely matters for this. And while the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, we know they're not actually as in sync as we would like. But there's good arguments to be made on both sides, because let's say they were all in absolute agreement on every detail. Well, then you would argue that that was collusion or fantasy or whatever. And so I'm fine with some of the standard apologetics that are saying, well, of course we would expect differences, being that these are different people writing around similar events. There are also real problems in trying to reconcile the different accounts of the Easter account. But the argument that's often made that these differences strengthen the reliability, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with the idea that the reliability of this account may be strengthened by differences, and it may be strengthened by unity. My issue isn't so much whether or not it's strengthened, but is it strengthened sufficient to warrant accepting the broader claims? And I don't see the value in attempting to disregard, to say, oh, well, there was a person and he said these things and we have these recordings, but let me just disregard the miracles because miracles are garbage. We know miracles don't count. That's not skepticism. Skepticism is, I have no idea whether or not miracles are possible. I need sufficient evidence to do it, so I don't get to disregard that. When I look at the New Testament, I have to look at all of it and say, I don't get to just throw these out. I don't get to pull a Thomas Jefferson and cut out all of the supernatural things and just keep the parts I like. I have to look at the whole picture and figure out, is there sufficient evidence to justify this? And for me, and I would argue, absent appeals to the supernatural that I don't think are justified, there simply isn't to believe the account. But,
Hey, thanks, guys.
sure.
Thank you.
So really quick question about Bayesian analysis. I'm actually paid to give them, and I never present them.
Sorry, you're actually what?
I'm paid to give Bayesian analysis,
Oh,
and
cool.
I never present them.
Oh, cool.
Never, ever, because they are great bullshit magnifiers. They're incredibly good at magnifying my biases and making me think that I'm right when I am horribly wrong.
Fun fact, I'm gonna try to raise money on a GoFundMe to have Blake change his middle name to Bayesian and put it on his license, because I think that would be awesome.
Really quick question for you, Blake.
Yeah.
Really quick question. Have you applied the same Bayesian analysis to the Greek mythology? Have you looked at what that gives you? If you apply the same starting conditions to Greek mythology and your same assumptions to something that we all, I think, in this room agree is total bullshit, what did you get?
Okay, so thank you. A couple quick things about Bayesian analysis, just for people who aren't aware of its canonical status. So this is a quote from Robert Matthews in Scientific American. He says, in recent years, scientists have become more comfortable with the idea of priors. As a result, Bayes' methods are becoming central to scientific progress in fields ranging from cosmology to climate science. In Nature magazine, Colin Houston and Peter Urbach published a piece. They say Bayesian scientific reasoning has a sound foundation in logic and provides a unified approach to the evaluation of deterministic and statistical theories, unlike its main rivals. One more thing. Scientific American, this is Chris Wiggins. Bayes' theorem is at the heart of everything from genetics to Google, from health insurance to hedge funds. It is a central relationship for thinking concretely about uncertainty. So you're saying it's
4 words.
Go ahead.
All right. As one who's done this many times.
That's
I'm
5,
embarrassed.
6, 7, 8.
4 words for Bayesian. Garbage in, garbage out.
Good.
And we would both agree with
Yep,
that.
I agree. I absolutely agree with that. So you do want to be responsible about what you put in, but you have to understand that when a lot of theists and people in the philosophy of religion are publishing in this, they're very well acquainted with the calculus, and they work hard to analyze their priors very carefully. Now, I'm not saying that it's perfect, but what I am saying is that there are rules, there are things you can apply, and again, when people start from different places, they can still meet in the middle.
So, very careful. You have to be very careful about your priors. You have to be very, very careful that when you're looking at them, and this is a thing that everyone does, is what you think is true is always the thing you put down. You have to be very, very careful that it's not just you that thinks your priors are correct, but the broader scientific community. So if you're wrong, you're going to be very wrong.
So I agree, and so does he. And when we've had conversations about Bayesian thing, one of the things I point out is that from a mathematical standpoint, I'm not qualified to actually assess this stuff, but you don't have to be mathematical to come up with your priors, and you can be as forgiving as you want. Let's say that, there's only a 1% chance, even though he might be personally convinced there's like a 90% chance. He can go with a 1% and show what the results are. I have concerns. I know you can pick out, hey, here's a guy who did a Bayesian analysis that says Jesus existed. Here's one who did a Bayesian analysis that says it doesn't exist. And neither of those are actually true because they're listing probabilities on a hypothesis. My concern is that I think it's a great tool, just like you can lie with statistics all day long. Statistical analysis is great. Samples are great, provided you get good sample size. You can do surveys, but a survey's not going to tell you necessarily what the people in my neighborhood think unless you actually survey the people in my neighborhood. And where I have problems with Bayesian analysis, apart from the fact that I'm not remotely an expert, is while it may apply in fields from cosmology to climate scenes, I have no good reason to think it applies to the metaphysical.
That's actually pretty fair.
Yeah.
Just another word of caution here. Any statistical method, you're standing on a limb whenever you do a statistical analysis. You're out there on a limb. You need evidence to confirm your statistical analysis. Otherwise,
You could lose an
just your
election.
idea. Actually, yes. Now, Bayesian analysis, you're not standing on a limb. You're very, very quickly, you end up standing on a twig. So you have to be very careful about every step of
You should
the way
email
you're
Blake.
doing
Yeah, and I agree with you. And again, that's why I'm saying you just have to be careful. Bayesian analysis, a lot of people think that our brains are actually Bayesian, much like, children are able to learn grammar in a way that isn't always sensible from the evidence that they have. And there are these structures in the brain that allow them to learn very quickly. And in the same way, yet, those same children would have a really hard time in school learning grammar, but they can do it. And in the same way, a lot of people think that our brain just naturally and very fluidly, if subconsciously, is doing Bayesian inference all the time. And I mention that because I think that it's the right way to update beliefs. I think it's mathematically rigorous. We can look at its very plausible axioms, and we can say, hey, this probability calculus works. And here's what Bayesian analysis does for us, is it exposes our biases, and it makes sure that we are very clear about what we're doing, and everybody can see it. Okay. Go ahead.
Strong recommendation. Apply the Bayesian
Next.
to a number of different problems. And see what you think later.
We got it. I'm actually, I hear stuff like that our minds intuitively do this, or I'm a little cautious about that, about labeling it Bayesian in the same way that you could argue that we do calculus. Anytime somebody throws a ball and you actually catch it, you could say that in some abstract sense your brain does calculus. The truth is your brain didn't actually do calculus. It's just calculus is what's used to describe the math behind what you did.
Yeah,
But-
and of course there are people that take exactly that position. I haven't researched it enough to know, but I know that that people come on both
Well,
sides.
I have, damn it, and I'm right. I need to be right about something on Bayes, but yeah, no, I don't.
This is directed at Matt. I have a question about possibility and probability. What standard for possibility would you use other than pure logical possibility? Because you seem to have some kind of a other category that you're trying to analyze a claim, a hypothesis about whether it's possible or not. What standard, other than just pure logical possibility?
It's a demonstration. So first of all, the difference I have between possibility and probability is a calculable thing.
Sure.
Possibility is kind of binary as to whether or not this is the case. For me, I think possibility needs to be demonstrated, and I also think impossibility needs to be demonstrated. I'm not convinced that something is possible until there's a demonstration of that, and I'm not convinced that something is impossible until there's a demonstration. Those are two separate claims, even though those are the only two possibilities. My position is I'm not convinced of either of which is correct. It's like, now I know I'm not quite to what you asked yet, which is what is the standard? I don't know how to describe it other than a demonstration. That demonstration is going to be different depending on what we're talking about. Is it possible for this die to roll a 6? You can demonstrate that by analyzing. You don't even have to roll the die. You can look at it and understand the basics of physics. As long as something is, well, like I was saying earlier, that if it's in the same category as something that we've demonstrated is possible, like that you could line up 18 dice here, and I would be able to say that, based on what we understand of physics and dice, et cetera, you could point to any one of them and say, is it possible for it to roll a 3? And my default is which could be wrong, could be like glued to the table and never roll, but my default is going to be yes. Logically, it is possible for that to roll a 3 based on the definition of the die, the physics, and other stuff. It's when we branch out of stuff. Is it possible that unicorns exist? Well, it depends on how you define unicorn. Is it possible for there to be a horse with a horn? I don't see any reason why that would be impossible. I don't know that it is the case, but from what we know about genetics and the way creatures grow horns, I would say a horse with a horn is possible. Now, if by unicorn you mean a magical being that only virgins can approach, I not only don't have good reason to think it's possible, I have good reason to lead me towards the idea that it might be impossible.
So are you saying it's the distinction between the kind of possibility you're talking about and logical possibility is undefinable? There's no way to define possibility?
It's claim dependent. Not all claims are the same. And so the more extraordinary it is, the more evidence you would need. And the more factors that are in there. There are some claims that are simple. 1 + 1 = 2. There's others that are more complicated, like, why did I choose to have a margarita today? There's a lot that goes into that. And if you'd have said beforehand, is it possible that Matt will have a margarita today? Well, of course it is. It's possible in the sense that we know that these things happen, or at least I know that these things happen. For something for which we have the individual variables, Matt, margarita, does he drink, blah, blah, blah. For something that we don't know the individual likelihood of any of those or that any of those are possible, we don't get to put them together. As soon as you inject, is it possible for an alien to serve Matt a margarita today? I have no way to know if that's possible or not, because there's a variable in there that we have no demonstration of possibility. And so my position is not that's impossible, it's I'm not convinced that it's possible yet. Does that make sense?
Sure, it's be a longer conversation. Thank you.
Sure. Anything to add, Blake?
Well, I was just going to say here it's important to introduce a distinction between what gets called epistemological possibility and metaphysical possibility. So when it comes to epistemological possibility, which I think is what you mean when you talk about something needs to be demonstrated possible, by epistemological possibility, we mean from a point of view, it sure seems like this is possible. So there are some, hold in your head like a really complex mathematical equation and then an answer. Okay? It's epistemologically possible, perhaps, when you look at that and you say, yeah, I guess it's possible that that's the answer because I don't know otherwise. But then there's this other thing. Logical possibility. And this is true regardless of what you think. And so I think it's important to make the distinction, and maybe, I don't know, maybe you're trying to figure out what he means by possibility, which of those two is he going for? And my guess is you mean epistemological possibility when you talk about, before you can say something's epistemologically possible, or that we ought to regard it as epistemologically possible, we need to demonstrate it perhaps through showing either prior instances, or it sounds like showing that the parts of what it's made of are possible, something like that.
So let me see if this clears this up. And I'll ask this both for both categories. When you say you look at an equation and you see this equation and the answer, and the question is it possible that that's the correct answer? And you say yes. What if I were to ask that, is it impossible that that's the correct answer? Would you also have to say yes?
Well, no, I mean, if it's the answer, then necessarily it's the answer. It's impossible for it not to be the answer.
No. We have an equation, and you're looking at it, and there's an answer out here, and what you said was roughly, I guess it's possible.
Yeah, epistemologically possible, right.
Is it also impossible?
Yes, it's epistemologically, It could be one or the other.
Sure.
Right?
So when we talk about epistemological possibility, impossibility, they're essentially equivalent, which is why I care more about the demonstration of what is actually possible. So in an abstract sense, when we're just thinking about it, x plus y equals 75. Is it possible, logically possible that 75 is the right answer? Yes. Is it logically impossible that 75 is the right answer? Yes. Is it actually the case that it's the right answer is a completely separate thing. But if we're looking at it and this inference that we make about what we know about a formula that's there and the potential pool of possible answers, if it's both logically possible and impossible, doesn't that mean that one's kind of irrelevant?
You mean it's epistemologically possible?
Sure, epistemologically both possible and impossible. Doesn't that make that one pretty much irrelevant? And now all we care about is whether it's empirically?
Well, if you get to the point of agreeing that it's epistemologically possible, that's at least a step forward in the program of discovering truth. Because
But we
some
just
people,
agreed it can be both.
Well, real quick, because some people, the notion of epistemological possibility is important because there are instances where you might hold up in your head a proposition, and someone could turn around and show you a proof that that is in fact impossible, in which case it is no longer an epistemological possibility.
Right, it's what?
It's epistemologically impossible.
Right.
And it's logically necessary.
And the other category of
approved.
possible?
Oh, metaphysical possibility.
So once they've shown that this is necessarily the answer, or that it is impossible that it's the answer, or a demonstration that's possible. So we get to a demonstration, now we're talking about metaphysical possibility.
We will have shown that it is epistemically necessary that it's metaphysically necessary.
Okay. I got you. Somebody else. So I think we would have shown that it's epistemically necessary that it is metaphysically possible.
Yeah, and I mean, very simply, the metaphysicals out there here, the epistemologicals in here, and basically, if we can latch onto this, they're going to be the same thing.
Yeah, but that epistemological, if we have, and the answer is yes, it's possible, yes, it's not, or impossible. That both of those are it's possible that it's possible and impossible. In that sense, then that's essentially useless.
I don't. How could something be possible and impossible at the same time?
You're the one that acknowledged that that's
Oh,
the
you mean
case.
epistemologically
Yes.
possible? Okay, yes, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
So
continue.
that renders that fairly useless because it doesn't tell us. It actually doesn't tell us anything.
Yeah. Once you've established that it's epistemically possible, then sure. Then I guess there's no point in even talking about its epistemic possibility because you already agree that it's possible. Sure.
Okay. And now I was about to quote Tommy Wonder, and so only magicians will get that. But let's go on to the next question because I don't want to hold everybody up. It's possible we could have more questions.
Mm-hmm. Very likely. So Blake, I want to try to recap your first statement on rationality to make sure I have the right understanding of it. Mm-hmm. Essentially, you have two axioms on this, and one is that based on direct observation, it is rational to have an understanding that such and such a thing is true. You gave an example of a
Do you want
of a
me to
tree.
read it again, just so for clarity?
Is this the
I
BST
remember
thing?
I remember your words
I like it.
pretty well,
Uh-huh.
and I agree with them. I just want to make sure that I understand it correctly.
Uh-huh.
So is that a fair approximation of what you said?
I honestly don't remember the precise words that you used, but
Okay.
nothing you
So-
said jumped out at me as
okay.
being, oh, that's not right.
Essentially, that your first axiom is that based on direct observation and experience, it's rational to conclude that such and such a thing is true.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't use the word axiom, but yeah, if B is directly evident to S, if a belief is directly evident to a subject at a particular time, then it's rationally acceptable for that subject.
And then the second part of that is based on other stacks of evidence in that same way of the first one. Even though it's indirectly observable, we can rationally conclude that that one is true too.
I don't follow. What are you saying?
So your second statement was that based on...
Here, I'll just read it.
Okay.
So the whole thing, a belief, B, is rationally acceptable to a subject, S, at time T, if and only if one of these two conditions are met. Or either one, actually, if either condition are met.
Right.
One, the belief, B, is directly evident to the subject at T, and I mentioned what directly evident meant. Or alternatively, B is evidentially well supported by other beliefs that are rationally acceptable for S at T.
Right. So a stack of beliefs based on the first one.
Yeah, so basically, right, you get that for your
So-
foundations,
so
and then
The
you
first
build
one's
up.
deductive, the second one's inductive.
Not quite. No.
So
but-
here's the example that you brought up a tree, right? You're walking down a sidewalk, you observe a tree, you touch a tree, and you hear birds and all, and this is a tree. Now in another situation, you're walking along, you feel shade, you hear birds, and you go, there's a tree here. Except it's not a tree, it's a cell phone tower disguised to look like a tree. How can, and this question is for both of you, how can you rationally come to a conclusion and ensure that that is not a false conclusion?
So the scenario we're picturing here is that something that seems just like a tree but isn't actually a tree. And the question is it rationally acceptable for someone to believe that's a tree even when it's not? Right. And I would say, sure, they'll be mistaken, but it's rationally acceptable.
Right, and I'm not arguing that. I'm asking, this is a false conclusion. It's totally rational that I got to that conclusion based on my prior experience and the evidence that I'm seeing, but I'm lacking a piece of knowledge to have the actual truth of the situation. So how do I, or anybody, avoid rationally coming to a false conclusion?
So are you basically asking, how do we deal as rational agents going through the world with the problem of philosophical skepticisms? And these are skepticisms like, man, how do I know that there even is an external world? Maybe what's happening is this is my dream world and there's just nothing to wake up to. That's solipsism.
No,
I wouldn't. So
yeah, that's way out there.
So hey, there's a tree, there's a cell phone tower, and all we're really concerned about is making sure that we don't misidentify a cell phone tower disguised as a tree as a tree. And the answer to that is, first of all, from Hume, who is my go-to and the only philosopher I think anybody needs to spend any time on, the wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. And by belief, what we're saying here is your confidence should be proportional to the evidence. And so it's perfectly acceptable if I'm walking along and maybe I'm blindfolded and unable to investigate, for me to rationally reach the conclusion that this cell phone tower disguised as a tree is a tree. Except that the conclusion I should really be reaching, which you will appreciate, is it is probable that this is a tree. And as soon as you do that, and you apply skepticism to where you are going to continue to investigate and explore this to the limits of your ability to gain information, We know that I can, if I have access to not necessarily the entire universe and information in the universe, but if I have access to all the information that I could attain from investigating, I would be able to tell the difference between a cell phone tower disguised as a tree and a tree. And so the answer to your question, which is going to irritate everybody, is you don't stop investigating and you don't reach a conclusion about what it is until you get that level of evidence. And what you do instead is, as you progressively get closer to that evidence, you proportion your confidence level that it is a tree or a cell phone tower disguised as a tree to whatever evidence you have. It is a never-ending pursuit, and all you should be doing is holding tentative views that are as proportional to the evidence as possible.
Yeah. And of course, this is something that's pretty unanimously agreed upon, that you want to proportion your beliefs to the evidence. One interesting thing, and this is something we won't necessarily have time to go into here, but when you say that you believe you can see a tree, and based on the seeming that it's a tree, conclude that it's epistemically probable that there's a tree, this would make use of, in order to make that it's not a leap, you would have to have something in your background knowledge that says, my cognitive faculties are reliable. If they're reliable, then when I seem to see a tree, then that would warrant my belief that it probably is a tree to some degree. And what's interesting about that conversation is that's something that theists will spend some time on, because they want to ask all the time, well, man, theists have a good reason to think that there's a well-ordered world and a well-designed design plan for the human mind, so that when they run into these situations, they don't have to worry as much about skepticism. And one of those interesting questions that people are always talking about nowadays is, if you're a naturalist, can you trust in your cognitive faculties? It's a really interesting conversation.
The way to figure out whether or not I can trust my cognitive faculties is to get independent confirmation. And in particular, to get independent confirmation from people that don't necessarily agree with me on my conclusion. So if I've concluded that it's a tree and you're convinced it's a cell phone tower disguised as a tree, if I go to you and get independent confirmation of the individual data components of that, set the conclusion about what it is aside, but we can agree that, hey, there's a wire here, and we can assess that. Even if we come to different conclusions, I can now be confident, or reasonably confident, that my senses were accurate in this, because you are getting the same information. The fact that we might come to a different conclusion has more to do with the baggage and biases we have. So I can come to a conclusion about how reliable my senses are. It's so good that now I'm 49, I need glasses to look at my phone when I haven't needed glasses ever. We can tell when something's an optical illusion. We can tell when we're getting auditory illusions. We're really good at that, and it's because of things like independent verification. If we only relied on our own experience, we would be a mess, because I would just think that the world was blurry.
Yeah, good. So when I say that they're saying that this is an interesting question, the kinds of challenges they're talking about are a little closer to the one like the solipsism when I was talking about, where you can't use the independent confirmation.
Yep.
And there are lots of interesting variations that might plague the atheistic worldview. So for example, some argue that if anything like naturalism is true and consciousness has anything like a chance of pervading the universe, then hey, it's very likely, in fact, that you're a simulation. There are arguments along these lines. Or if some of the most prominent cosmological models without a beginning are true, then it's actually very likely that you're a brain that actually just fluctuated into existence just now, believing you're in the middle of this room having a debate and you're about to, fluctuate right back out of existence.
Yeah, they're unfalsifiable. The problem is that the theistic propositions don't resolve it, because they're still contingent on, if you are that brain, you could also believe that you are a god, or that you are in a universe created by a God that gives you the epistemic justification to believe you're not that brain.
Yeah, so a couple things. So there's a few more to, that could be gone through, but here's what you want to make sure to do. Here's where theists might come back and say, but what's important is to make sure that your beliefs are not in probabilistic tension. When you look at the theist's worldview, insofar as he believes in a God, he can manage all of these skepticisms because of his basically belief in a benevolent circumstance that is handed down by God. Whereas the naturalistic worldview doesn't have a tool like that to help reduce the tension. And so some of the discussion is, holy smokes, it could be really awkward to be an atheist, walking around as an atheist, when there's no thing that functions like God to help him out. That's the thought, anyways.
Except from the theistic standpoint, it is the belief that there's a God that does this. And there's nothing about the belief that is prohibited under an atheist worldview. So the thing that a naturalistic world would have that would provide that epistemic comfort is fantasy. I can come up with a fantasy that says, for me, I have no solution to the problem of hard solipsism. I have no way to demonstrate to myself or anybody else, if there is anybody else, that I'm not a brain in a vat. However, I can imagine, or I could even be convinced that I have a justification that gets me out of this trap of hard solipsism, and yet I still can't demonstrate it. It is essential. This is where you get to the presuppositionalist. You have to presuppose something. I presuppose that reason is reasonable, because that's really handy, and everybody seems to agree.
But these aren't issues of reason. They
are the issues of the undergirders of reason, about whether or not your experiences are reliable. If I'm a brain in a vat, I could still have a fiction playing in my head that I'm not a brain in a vat, and that I am epistemically justified in accepting this because there is a God who loves me, whether that God exists or not. It's like the invisible friend that the kid has. That can and I never say this to be dismissive or belittling. An invisible friend can bring legitimate comfort to a kid if they sincerely believe it. It can alleviate all sorts of trauma and other things. It may, in fact, be a good thing in perhaps small doses. I see that the possibility still exists. If in fact I'm right, and I am, but no, if in fact I'm right, and I live in a world where there's no God, I can fully accept that somebody like Cy ten Bruggencate or another presuppositionalist can certainly derive comfort and internal consistency for logical grounding by appealing to a God, whether a God exists or not. I just don't think it solves the problem in an actual sense. It solves the problem in the philosophical sense.
Let me say one last thing, and then you can have the last word, and
we'll just
the
go
next
on.
questioner. But I actually don't think you can just assume that I'm reasonable and get out of the problem, because a lot of these things don't assume that you're unreasonable. For example, a Boltzmann brain could be completely reasonable. It's just that the environment around him is misleading him. And you have several variations of these skepticisms that, in fact, require unique, different assumptions to get out of them. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to assume something, what's really nice about theism is it's one simple assumption that gets you out of all of the skepticisms at once. So,
Sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
There's nothing simple about that assumption, because you and I both are under the position that we accept that reason is reasonable. You're going a step further with the biggest unwarranted, unjustified catch-all assumption
Remember,
ever.
I didn't say that. I didn't say anything about
Do you not think
questioning
reason is reasonable?
No, that's what I was just trying to explain, is that we can grant that you're reasonable. The issue is that the skepticisms will attack you from different points. Some of them will question your reasonability. Others will question your environment and your ability to reach reasonable conclusions, even if you're reasonable, because of the environment is sabotaging your ability to do so.
I'm only objecting to the notion that presuming that there's a God that serves as the answer to all of these things, it's simple in the sense that you're only proposing one thing, but it is a very, very, very complex thing that you are proposing, something with immense capabilities to resolve all of these things. This is something that Dawkins pointed out as well.
I would love to talk about
We'll do that
to the
another
next
time.
question, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think I have the most important question of the night, and that is, will you guys get together with Steve and have him play The Legend of Zelda so he'll know who Ganon is
yes.
and not embarrass himself
Necessary.
again? Yes.
I haven't turned my Switch on in a couple months because I've been traveling, so you can borrow it.
Matt and I actually we're talking about The Legend of Zelda not long ago. This is what our Facebook chats look like.
Okay, so yeah, if you could get Steve on that, I think that would
I
be
appreciate
really
that,
All right,
Brandon.
so-
That'll help me out.
all right.
I've got to relearn the game at this point, I think.
And it can be any of them. It doesn't have to be Breath of the Wild. But I mean,
It
why
has to
not?
be Breath of the Wild. Come on.
All right, anyway, so moving on. My real question, and I'll mostly direct this towards you, Matt, but Blake, if you feel need to assume the mirror of the question and answer it as well, please go ahead. So I love how you guys talk. I mean, I've heard you guys both together on multiple topics, multiple debates over the past several years, and you always approach each other with a good humor, good respect for one another, and I think it's because of that I can ask this question. So you both seem to appreciate the sort of reasonableness of each other. Now, you obviously disagree on where that reason takes one another, how you evaluate some of the evidence, things like that. But Matt, would someone like Blake, who is not so much a blind faith person, I mean, he obviously does his homework. He's not someone to shy away from the positions of the other side, to try and read them carefully, represent them charitably, things like that. What is it you think he's missing in his rationality, in his processes, that keeps him from getting to where you are? And Blake, if you want to take the same question for Matt afterwards, I'd love to hear what both of you have to say about that.
Oh, this is great. Thank you for the question, not for the applause. Although thanks for that too. I have no idea. Every time I think I know, it gets derailed. I will say, and this is a bit of a dodge, there's a video on my Patreon project. Blake was gracious enough to come down, hang out at the house. We sat on my love seat. And we had a great conversation. There was a moment when we were talking about how you would go about demonstrating something, where I talked about, imagine that the two of us have sat in this room forever, there's no window, there's no door, and we've never been outside, and you're telling me that there's somebody on the other side of the wall who can move things in here with their mind. How would we go about testing that? And he came up with a great, what I would say, starting skeptic answer to how we would test for that. This person would communicate to him what he was going to do, and then it would happen, et cetera. There's a bunch of problems with it, because there's problems with anything, when you're going down these roads. But there was an aspect of this that I pointed out, which is, if we've lived in this room forever, and there's no doors and no windows, it's a presumption that there is a wall, that there is in fact another side of the wall. How do you demonstrate that the walls and the ceiling and the floor don't just go on forever? If you want to tell me there's somebody on the other side of the wall who can do something, you would need to first demonstrate, I would think, not necessarily first. I keep saying first, and I probably shouldn't. One demonstration that would be necessary would be that there is in fact a wall that there's another side to, and not just infinite. It's like the boundaries of the universe. As far as we know, maybe there's a multiverse, maybe there's any number of explanations, but you would have to demonstrate that there could be something beyond the boundaries of our universe. And when he talked about the telepathic person conveying what they were going to do and then doing it, and then I asked, you'd have to go back and watch it to find out exactly how this was. I tried to get to a point where I was talking about, how is this functionally different from claiming that there's a God who can do these things? This is the same thing I'm talking about when I say, what can this guy start this table on fire with his brain, is functionally identical to the table's on fire because God did it. I have no way to distinguish between the two, and so I cannot reach a conclusion that God is a more probable explanation than that he's, fire starter. That acknowledgement that I don't know how the table caught on fire, I don't know how the universe started, I don't know what's beyond the boundaries of this room that I'm in, and there needs to be a real strong demonstration before I can say, yes, I think that's the best answer. I don't know what the actual roadblock is, but there is something foundational to the difference in the way we look at grounding our epistemology that I hope in the coming 40 years that I won't be around that long, 15, 20 years, that we have these conversations. I hope we can get closer to finding it out, but I don't have an answer to your question despite rambling for 5 minutes. Sorry.
I got to echo this. That's a wonderful question. It really, that's something we should be asking ourselves all the time to each other, as well as to each other. First thing I got to say is I think Matt's IQ is probably through the roof. He thinks incredibly quick, and I couldn't throw enough praises his way in terms of how intelligent he is. I think where he goes wrong, as I've alluded to in our discussions, is down to the method that he espouses. He says, well, it's just science, but it's more than that. It's actually a very complex method. It's not, the Bayesian method. It's not anything that is standard. And that's part of what my strategy was that I wanted to do today, is I really wanted to nail down all the pieces, and it just didn't seem like it was going to work well. But I would, I guess I think at the end of the day, I don't think the method is justified, and I think that as we would work through it, here are all these counterexamples, things that aren't demonstrated but are clearly rationally believed, or at least not demonstrated in the way that meets the conditions he's thinking. So I actually think it's, despite Matt's intelligence, it's the method that's causing trouble. And I would recommend some more canonical methods instead.
And in quick notes, you're always welcome to come back down and we can hash this stuff out. There's an interesting thing here, in much the same way that when we talked about the actual subject of this debate, can faith be rational, where it turns out we don't disagree on his definition and we don't disagree on mine. On his definition of confidence, yes, it can be rational. On mine of as an epistemology, of course it's not rational. There's not disagreement there. It's curious, if you were to ask my mom this question, what is it that Matt's got wrong? She would give things like, Matt is in denial of the inner witness of the Holy Spirit. If you were to ask a former preacher of mine, he would say, Matt just hasn't had the direct experience with Jesus that I have. It's one of the reasons why I love having conversations with Blake, which I'll keep doing. I don't care how many people complain that we're the only people we ever debate. It's because those aren't the answers that I get from him. And all of his answers prompt thought and further discussion, whereas the type of answers you're going to get from my mom or a former preacher are basically just roadblocks. It reminds me of a debate I did in Canada where there were two preachers up there who essentially did this argument of God will reveal himself to anybody who does so, with an open heart, blah, blah, blah. And I got pretty ticked because how dare you suggest that I didn't sincerely and honestly seek God as much as the dude who found God because God found his car keys. There's clearly a problem here. That statement from that preacher is essentially, I'm right and I can't possibly be wrong. So the fact that Matt hasn't experienced what I've experienced and reached this conclusion means that there's something wrong with Matt. Matt's hardened his heart. He's turned his, and this is similar to what you get from my mom. And that's not the kind of conversation we have, which is why we can keep doing this. I'll never debate my mom in public.
Word of advice, I don't think anyone should debate their mom in public.
I'd like to stay on good terms with my mom if I can.
Yes, sir.
This is directed towards Matt. My question is, what is your explanation for the origin of the initial singularity of the Big Bang? And then how is your faith in whatever that is rational?
I don't know. I don't have an explanation. I don't have any expertise in the area. I accept, and this is the best way I can put it, I accept that the best explanation we currently have for the origin of the universe is summarized by Big Bang cosmology. I have a friend, as I mentioned earlier, who's currently evaluating the math on an alternate cosmology, something alternate to the current standard model. And his initial investigation showed that the math works out better, that it's more consistent. That may be the model that ultimately supplants what we currently refer to as Big Bang cosmology. So whereas in the past I would say, well, of course I accept the Big Bang, I've grown a bit. And now I say, not that I accept that the Big Bang cosmological model is the truth, because science doesn't tell you the truth. It makes tentative...
Best probability.
Yeah, it makes tentative evaluations based on the best available evidence. And so all I can say about the Big Bang is I'm unqualified to do the math and to assess it, but the people who have a demonstrated expertise in this area are fairly consistent in saying this is the best explanation we currently have and that it's subject to revision. And I'm fine with that because I'd much rather say I don't know or I'm not convinced that we've reached the final explanation than I am to say I know that I know that I know that I know that Big Bang is the explanation.
Well, okay, but my question is, your faith is in materialistic naturalism.
So I don't have faith in material.
Well, okay, but you defend it.
Now we're back to the word that I avoid anyway.
Yeah, I know, but you strongly defend that position.
Yeah, because the method, the process by which we go about methodological naturalism of not being able to offer supernatural explanations, science has been the demonstrably most consistently reliable method of accurately describing the universe in a way that is useful and productive. If another method, it's like if I'm crossing the street and there's a bus coming towards me, my brain is not necessarily doing calculus, but it's figuring out, how fast I have to move. If we looked at the various models and there was one that said, yes, you're going to make it, and one that said, no, you're not going to make it across the street, that's a rather dangerous prospect. And when it comes to science, when it comes to the foundations of methodological naturalism, It's consistently saved our lives. It has consistently given us the best understanding. It's how we have vaccines. It's how we know about climate change. And we can be wrong on any number of these things, but all we can ever do is take a method, see what results it produces, and whether or not those results are useful and seemingly accurate in describing the world we live in. So I have to go with the most accurate model I have. We talked before about whether or not faith would be rational as an epistemology, and I think we're in agreement that as an epistemology, it's not. If somebody can come up with a better epistemology, something that's more reliable from science than the scientific methods, there's not a method. I don't know what it would be, but I know that they'd probably first have to demonstrate its reliableness by using the methods we currently have. It's like coming up with a new micrometer. You would have to show that it's as accurate as the previous ones and where its benefits are. And all this is a product of demonstration. There's no easy answer to it. If you want to call it faith in the sense of confidence, I have monumental confidence that the scientific methods, the critical thinking, examination, independent verification, replication, that these have consistently led us to the best understanding. They're not proclamations of truth. They're all tentative.
Yeah, but the problem is the initial singularity brought into existence the natural. So your faith is in something that prior to the initial singularity didn't exist.
Well, you could argue also, as Hawking has, that the phrase prior to the singularity is nonsense because prior is a temporal thing and time began.
Yeah, but then your faith in nothing.
This phrasing is kind of one of the things that troubles me because now you're saying faith in nothing.
Well, okay.
No, I have confidence that we have the best description, that I'm accepting the best descriptions currently. But if the answer is I don't know, then that's the answer I give. I don't know what came before the Big Bang. I don't even know if before the Big Bang is a sensible phrase because time began with the Big Bang in that model.
Everything natural began at the Big Bang.
Well, you say everything natural. I don't know that there's anything other than the natural. I have no reason to think that there's anything other than the natural. So why put the
science? In science, the evidence points to a singularity.
Okay.
And at that singularity, that which is natural is coming into existence.
Not necessarily.
Well, okay. Then I don't know.
The local presentation of our universe begins at that point, but there's no reason to think that something like a singularity couldn't have existed. Well, okay, you can't exist absent time, so yeah. Why the hell am I talking about the Big Bang? I'm not a physicist. All I'm saying is
you have faith in something.
I have confidence in something that has demonstrated consistently that it's reliable. What other method could I possibly have confidence in? What other method is there that has demonstrated any reliability that is worthy of me putting confidence in it?
Well, I don't have a problem. I have a lot of faith in science, too.
I'm just saying, what else could I possibly have confidence in?
And this is the question. If science is pointing to a singularity, which you just said
The current one, yeah.
It's the most probable theory at this time.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Okay. At that singularity, the natural is coming into existence.
Our local presentation of the natural.
The singularity is everything that is natural.
Well, there's nothing necessarily unnatural about the singularity.
Well, time, space, matter, material, laws of physics are all coming into existence.
I guess I'm just not understanding what you're getting at.
Well, what's before that if the natural...
Before that is a nonsensical phrase based on our current understanding.
Well, you don't want to acknowledge the supernatural.
Well, I would be happy to acknowledge the supernatural the minute somebody demonstrates that it exists.
Well, I think we've had a good back and forth. Would you like to interject? Yes.
Yeah, just a few quick points. When you ask what method is better, what could I use, this is where I'd, of course, recommend these other canonical forms of reasoning: abduction, induction, deduction.
Bayesian.
Yeah, of course, in Bayesian.
Wait, are you suggesting that I'm not using deduction, induction, or abduction at all?
No, I'm sure.
I mean, because those are the only three.
But those aren't under the scientific method, right?
I'm talking about the scientific method with regard to coming to the best understanding of the material world. I'm fine with abstract arguments. I make deductive, inductive, and abductive arguments all the time.
Okay, so this is actually I suppose where it'd be good for us to explore further what you mean. So it sounds like when you say science, maybe you mean something not science technically.
I'm
but
fine with
something-
abductive reasoning. That's reasoning to the best explanation. But where we differ here seems to be what should qualify as a candidate explanation.
So then here's the thing is when you say something like, before I will put it into the pool of options to infer to the best explanation. For those of you who don't know what abduction is, that abduction is short for inference to the best explanation. What you're doing is you're adding a rule onto abduction that doesn't exist
No.
in the concept.
I'm not
Why
adding a
Why-
rule to abduction. There's no rule about abductive reasoning about what technically should qualify as a candidate explanation.
Yeah, you can put whatever you want into the pool. There are no rules in terms of what you can
Yeah,
put into the pool.
but if you give a damn about whether or not something is likely to be an explanation, you have to care about what criteria we use to determine what are candidate explanations. Otherwise, you end up with he can start fires with his mind as a candidate explanation.
Excellent. So that goes into the pool, but it's analyzed by a virtue in inference to the best explanation called plausibility. And so in Bayesian terms, that gets cashed out in terms of prior probability. So
Right.
there's no rule in the beginning that says you can't even analyze these or talk about it. They say let it compete. It's going to lose in the end because it's missing either a theoretical explanatory virtue or it's going to have a really low prior probability. There is no
I
rule that
think
says demonstrate the possibility first.
It may be telling that you think I don't know this, which is cool. What we're talking about, you can throw whatever you want in as a candidate explanation. You're correct. I'm talking about whether or not it's reasonable to include things as a candidate explanation. And there's a problem here. If I list all the candidate explanations I can think of, what's the likelihood that I've included the actual explanation?
Yeah, it's going to depend on.
You have no way of knowing.
You're talking about inference.
You don't know what you don't know.
You're talking about inference to the best explanation, just for clarity, not Bayesian.
But if I only know
epistemology.
two explanations that I throw in there, the inference to the best one is going to come up with one of those. But what if there's 1,000 or 1,000,000 candidate explanations in there? What if the right one, what if the most plausible one is excluded because I'm not putting it in there? What if these the candidates I'm putting in there are actually impossible and I don't know it? Like, what if it's impossible for someone to stare at this table and start a fire with their mind? Then it is a mistake for me to include it, especially if the actual explanation isn't there, because that one can come out as the most probable explanation despite being impossible.
I'm aware, and so I commend you. This is in philosophy called the problem of the bad lot. How do you know that within your pool of explanations, if you're focusing on inference to the best explanation, how do you know the best one is in the pool? And I think that's a great point. It's one that I make when I talk to people. And there are more modest conclusions in inference to the best explanation than, hey, this is the absolute best, but there's tons of work being done on it. That's incidentally one of the reasons why I favor Bayesian analysis. But in both of these cases, my point is that among all the academics working on it, there's nobody that says anything like, you first have to pass this test of demonstrating it to be possible. They just go at it.
Which means that they're potentially including explanations that could come out as the best explanation despite being impossible.
In inference to the best explanation
Despite
because of
being
the
impossible.
problem of the bad lot. But remember, that's
This
not
is
a
where
that's
skepticism
only a
comes in.
problem for some models of inference to the best explanation.
This is where skepticism comes in, because abduction is incredibly useful when you have good information. If we know that, like we had a list of all the people who were in the room, and we wanted to find out who stuck the chewing gum under the table. I saw you, by the way. Abductive reasoning, we could enter everybody here as a candidate. We could also exclude Trump. He wasn't here. So we know that we can exclude it. But what if something happened that we didn't know about? This is the problem of the bad lot, whether or not the right answer is included. What if somebody who wasn't aware of this pool included a unicorn in the lot? And it turns out that unicorns are defined as animals that love to chew gum and put it underneath the table. Then all of a sudden, by definition, this becomes the most probable explanation from our pool. despite the fact that it should have never been in the pool to begin with. I understand that's not really a problem, because what you're supposed to do with abductive reasoning after you go on, when you're making this Bayesian analysis towards the best explanation, you are supposed to gather more and more data. You are supposed to make sure that you can do your best to exclude the answers that shouldn't be there and appropriately weight the ones that should be. That is the skepticism in action. But the time to say, I have concluded that I have the best explanation, is once we've gotten to a point where we've eliminated the likelihood or minimized the likelihood that we have flawed explanations in the pool or impossible explanations in the pool, and after we have enough data. I don't see how this applies when we're talking about, the possibility of God and other things as explanation.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you're disagreeing with anything that I said previously. Are you specifically
Not about the
disagreeing?
reasoning. I'm disagreeing with the sense that you thought I was opposed to abductive reasoning or using this pool. All I'm talking about, abductive reasoning is useful. It is a guide that can get you towards possible, probable explanations. But the time to believe that you have the right explanation is after there's actual evidence for it and you've done your due diligence. This is why we rely on deductive reasoning more than inductive reasoning, more than abductive reasoning, by and large, for understanding the world.
Would you make one more comment about it? Is there another person with a question? Yeah, make one last comment about it, and then we'll move to
Yeah, I would just reiterate that, of course, if you use abductive reasoning, set aside Bayesianism for now, which is my favorite, but if you use abductive reasoning, then of course you do your due diligence and stuff. The point that I was making is that in none of this is there ever a step where you first ask, is this a possibility?
I'm not saying that is a step in abductive reasoning. I'm saying it's a step in analyzing whether or not your abductive reasoning has led you to the right conclusion.
As I understood, and I apologize, let me ask, you first, before it can even go into the pool to apply abductive reasoning, you have to demonstrate that it's a candidate before it can even get into the pool.
No, you have to demonstrate that it's a candidate before you can conclude that it's the most probable explanation, not before it can go in the pool. You can put whatever you want in the pool.
Okay.
next question.
This is where my brain shuts down, so just
No, you're fine.
So, first I wanted to put out the observation that the roadblock that y'all might be running into when you're debating, that I run into with debating atheists versus somebody that believes, is you get a lot of assumptions that atheists believe that God is a supernatural creature, that God is a supernatural, and that's a reasonable expectation, because that's kind of the standard that everybody holds God to. But to move forward with the debate, it might be a valuable tool to assume that God is not a supernatural entity of some sort, and that it doesn't defy the laws of physics, and then start debating the merits of faith and the merits of God based on God as an existing or previously existing entity or thing.
So I can jump into that. And actually, it's related to kind of what was being talked about before. God is traditionally defined as something that's not temporally prior to the natural world, but is in fact logically or causally prior to the world. So that's the relationship between God and the universe, or God and the natural world. When we talk about the natural in particular, there's debates over what exactly people mean by this. What is naturalism? What's involved? Typically, though, you're going to want to frame it in terms of mathematics. So you're going to have your initial conditions, your starting entities, and you're going to want to say that the whole story can be told by applying the laws of physics to those entities. Now, that's one notion of naturalism that's popular. But on that notion, God wouldn't be natural, because God can't be described by mathematics. So I would have a problem with calling God natural.
Okay.
I'm glad you said that, because I was sitting here going, gosh, here you're saying atheists, kind of assume that God is supernatural. And I'm like, I not only assumed that as an atheist, I assumed it when I was a theist, and so is almost everybody I've ever had this conversation with.
Yeah,
So.
no, like I said, that's kind of the default.
Email me sometime about a natural God, because, if you just want to say like margaritas are God, I'm like, I agree with you, they exist and they're awesome, but I don't think they deserve all of the entirety of the label.
Yeah. Well, and this is a little bit separate from the question that I had. So the example that I've given in the past for God, for using God as an approaching the argument of God.
Is there a question involved with it?
Yeah, there is a question involved.
Okay.
It's a little related. Sorry. So you create an AI. That AI is capable of doing everything that humans do. It evolves, it grows, it learns, it eventually learns. It's capable of reproducing itself. You put down the limitations of its universe is that table. Maybe they're nanite scale, whatever it happens to be. But you've set the universe at that scale. 10 million generations later, this AI has no idea you exist, but you do. And so the question that actually comes down to is, can you rationalize the unknowable? So I have no way of proving right now.
You didn't describe something that was unknowable. You described something that was unknown.
Yeah.
There's a difference between unknown. If I created a bunch of nanites AI and their universe is this table, unless you put some, and they can do everything humans can do, and et cetera, unless you put some limit on it that you didn't describe, there's nothing preventing me from communicating with them anytime I want. There's nothing in the God models that's preventing God from showing up right here and demonstrating himself. The fact that he doesn't, I think, is evidence that he doesn't exist or doesn't want us to know he exists. Either way, that's not my problem, just like it's not the nanites' problem.
Yeah.
But are they justified in not believing, not accepting that I exist? Yes, as long as I don't demonstrate myself, they would be unjustified to believe that I do exist.
So, well, and that's the question: is there any way to rationally justify the nanites on the table theorize that you exist in some way, or have an hypothesis?
I think
theories are wrong.
This is what we're talking about with regard.
Hypothesis and hypothesize.
This is what we regard to.
Rationally.
This is what we were talking about earlier. The nanites here, there may be pathways, especially with limited information, where it might be entirely rational for them to conclude I exist. It would happen to be the case that I was right. But whether or not I exist is independent from whether or not they are engaged in rational thought to reach the conclusion. The question is, if they have access to, what's the best phrase for this? Where I was talking earlier before about a least common denominator and not having enough information. If we took the pool of information that was available to them and their understanding of their universe, if they could do everything that humans can do, so we're going down that road. I think that it would be that they could come up with no universal rational justification for accepting that I exist if I'm not actually offering any evidence that I am. Their existence alone is not enough to infer it. Now, there may be something specific about this universe that, the only way, I mean, they learn enough about the laws of physics that this just can't happen unless we are a table in a universe type thing.
Yeah.
If we go down that route,
a parallel analogy to a
yeah, it may be possible
like
that they could come up with something that is an inference, but there would also be something that's kind of demonstrable in this. Demonstrable doesn't mean, hey, I can pick it up and show you. It's about, everything you learn, you're going to learn through your senses, but you can have reasoning that's abstract.
Yeah.
So the question, the answer is, I have no idea what's necessarily rational or irrational for those because we can't sit here, we don't have time to go through all the potential information they have. But if you want to make this analogous, then we're right back where we started at the beginning of the debate. I'm an atheist. I don't think it's justified to believe that a God exists. I think every argument that's been presented in favor of it has flaws. I think the methodologies that are being espoused have flaws. And Blake thinks the same thing with regard to my methodology.
Yeah.
So, Blake, do you have any comments for the nanites on the table?
No, I'll let
you
that
gotta-
one stay
you
on the
gotta leave
table.
that alone.
Well, what we're going to do, I think there's one more person with a question. I'd like to go ahead and go to him, if we could do that and keep it moving, because we're going to do some closing remarks, if we could do that. Thank you so much.
I'll try and be more succinct on this last one.
Hello, I came in about an hour ago, so I missed both of you give your presentation. But my question had to do with the title of the topic tonight. So I wanted to know how each of you define both faith and rational in your presentation, because in my mind, I think that faith needs to be unpacked. Like, it's a little more than confidence, and I know that Matt probably understands that, and he's just doing it for
I can do this real fast.
brevity purposes. But
I promise.
yeah, so
By and large, faith is referred to as confidence. That's how the believers tend to view it. I also found an instance where I think it's referred to as sort of the epistemology, the foundation of the evidence. Blake challenged that. And what I said was that if faith is just confidence, then of course confidence can be rational. If it is more than that, if it is epistemology, then I don't see how it can be rational. And Blake actually agreed with that as well. There was no actual presentation because he filled in at late notice, and so we just decided we'd talk. So yeah, it's kind of complicated, and the thing that I think we both, or I stressed, but I think he agrees, is that we should probably do a better job of making sure we're clear with all kinds of language, not the least of which is faith when we're using it. I, in my experience, have people telling me that faith is the thing they go to when they don't have a good reason. He was arguing that from a far more academic standpoint, and from 91% of Christians polled, that they don't mean blind faith at all. They think they have good reasons, and of course atheists don't think they have good reasons, which is why we're going to keep doing these debates for, well, till one of us convinces the other at least.
Yeah, so long story short, we actually did cover precisely that before you had arrived, and I think we agree that at least a common understanding of Christians when they use the word faith is that it's pretty much analogous to trust.
And there will be a video.
Yeah, you can watch the video. They'll publish this online on YouTube as well.
My last question for Blake is there ever a point in a Christian's life that faith is so at odds with reason that we should actually abandon faith in cases like the mother in early 2000 in Houston who drowned her children because she said that God told her to do so? How does a Christian approach those sort of cases where you're dealing with the purely subjective?
Yeah, I can absolutely see someone who rationally should abandon faith. Again, the whole Bayesian thing is you can have evidence for and you can have evidence against, and despite where you start, you deal with evidence enough and it's going to take you towards the truth, and maybe that truth is there is no God. So in that circumstance, yeah, I think that can absolutely happen.
God, I'm going to soundbite that. For fun, not to make you look bad at all.
Thank you. Well, do we have any comments in the dialogue that y'all like to wrap up between each other, or do you want to move into some closing remarks?
Do we even want to do closing remarks?
Well, just anything you want to close up with. It's not like a closing statement or anything official.
Oh, I'll make this easy and quick since I will talk forever. I look forward to doing this again, either in public or come down to the house and we could chat about the stuff that we do. I already said enough stuff about how I actually, I love the fact that we can disagree and how we disagree. And it's always instructive for me, and I hope it's instructive for other people.
Yeah, and I, of course, echo that. I love these conversations. It's good to explore truth together. I think at the end of the day, everyone here, ideally, is on the same team in the sense that we can look at each other as being mistaken. We have bad information. But at the same time, we're all here because we're interested in the topic, and we're interested in, hey, maybe there's a thought that I hadn't come across. We enjoy seeing that play out, and so in that sense, there's a camaraderie here, and I think that we should build into that, and I appreciate everyone so much for inviting me to be a part of it. And,
yeah, thanks you guys for coming.
Yeah.
Let's give our participants a round of applause, appreciation.